Do-hyun opened his eyes and didn't know where he was. The ceiling was white, not gray with frost, not covered in mold, white. An ordinary ceiling in an ordinary apartment with a crack in the corner that he'd remembered from the very first day he'd rented it. He was lying on his sagging bed in a t-shirt with a supermarket logo. A streetlight was glowing outside the window. Warm yellow light fell on the wall, and Do-hyun stared at it as if he'd seen something impossible. Because it was impossible. The last thing he remembered was the cold. The kind of cold that makes you stop shivering. You just lie there and wait. The basement of the neighboring building. An empty backpack with a single crushed package of cookies. And laughter from above. The laughter of the people he'd been feeding for 3 months. The people to whom he'd given everything he'd taken from the warehouse. The people who'd told him he was alone and needed less. And then silence. He died in that silence. He definitely died. Do-hyun sat up on the bed and looked at his hands. His fingers were intact, warm. No black spots from frostbite. He bent them and straightened them. Then again. On the TV sitting on the nightstand, someone was mumbling about the won exchange rate. On the table stood a half-eaten bowl of instant noodles, steam rising from it, still warm. He got up and walked to the window. His legs obeyed him. His knees didn't creak from the cold. He placed his palm on the glass, and the glass was warm. Outside the window was the courtyard. A familiar courtyard. The swing where Mina, the neighbor's daughter, used to sit. Mr. Park's car with its cracked bumper. The light in the window across the way, where the Cho family lived. The very same family that had taken his last can of stewed meat and slammed the door in his face. Right now, a light was on in their window, and shadows were flickering. They're having dinner. They were having a quiet dinner in their warm apartment, unaware that in 3 months the world would freeze over. Do-hyun stepped away from the window. He sat back down on the bed, very slowly. And then he felt it. Something clicked in his head. It didn't hurt. It wasn't loud. It was as if someone had opened a door to a room that hadn't been there before. He sensed a space. An empty, cool, dry space the size of a small warehouse. It was somewhere off to the side of reality, invisible, but absolutely real. He could feel its walls, its floor, its empty shelves. 20 square meters of waiting space. Do-hyun covered his face with his hands and began to cry. Silently. No sobs. Tears simply flowed between his fingers and dripped onto his t-shirt with the supermarket logo. He wasn't crying out of fear, not out of joy. It was something else. Something very grown up and very cold. Relief. The relief of a man who'd been given a second chance and who knew exactly what he would do with it. This time, he wouldn't feed anyone for free. This time, he would feed only his own. Do-hyun wiped his face with the hem of his t-shirt and stood up. He walked over to the table. He took the noodles and ate them standing up, slowly, chewing each bite thoroughly. In his past life, he'd forgotten how to eat slowly by the second week of winter. Now he forced himself to do it, because now he had time. Exactly 90 days until the thermometer in Seoul read -40 and never rose above 0 again. He set the empty bowl on the table and sat down on the floor. He leaned his back against the wall. He closed his eyes and began to count. Not money, not days. He began to count people. Those who had betrayed him in his past life. The neighbor from 702. Aunt Park. A kind, smiling woman who brought him tangerines on Chuseok and, 4 months into winter, was the first to tell him he needed to leave the building. His upstairs neighbor, Young Ho, a childhood friend. They used to play soccer together in the courtyard of this very building. Young Ho came to see him in the 3rd month of winter. He was smiling. He said he wanted to help, and then he took his backpack with his last supplies and said it would be better for everyone this way. The Che family from the apartment across the hall. A husband, a wife, and 2 children. He gave them the canned meat because the children were crying from hunger. They took the canned meat and that very evening voted to evict him. Do-hyun opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling. A crack in the corner. The warm light of a lamp. The sound of the TV. A normal world where all these people are still kind and polite because there's food in the fridge and the radiators are warm. He knew what they would become. He had seen it. Now he knew that kindness without teeth is just a way to die first. Do-hyun got up and walked to the closet. He took out an old notebook and a pen. He sat down at the table and began to write a list. In the left column, the names of those he needed to take with him. Those who, in their past lives, remained human to the very end. Those who didn't betray him. Minsu, the nurse at the local clinic. The only one who treated his frostbitten fingers and didn't ask for extra payment. Ari, the barista at the coffee shop by the warehouse. She poured him a double serving into his cup when he was already staggering from hunger. Ji-yu, an engineer, the only one who didn't laugh when he said it was going to be cold. Hana, the student cashier at his supermarket. She told him straight to his face that he'd be devoured for his kindness. She turned out to be right. Emma, an American woman from the apartment across the courtyard. She shared her rations with him until the very end. She was kicked out of the building before him because she was a foreigner. Soyeon, a former classmate, his first love whom he never asked out on a date. He met her in line for bread. They talked for 5 minutes. That same evening, she died when the store collapsed. 6 names. 6 people he'll take with him this time, at any cost. He didn't write anything in the right-hand column. The right-hand column was for those he needed to cut out. But he didn't have to write anything. He already remembered every face, every smile that turned into a snarl, every kind word that turned out to be a trap. Do-hyun closed his notebook. He glanced at his watch. 10 o'clock at night, October, a warm October evening. Someone was laughing outside the window, walking the dog, living an ordinary life, unaware that there were 90 days left. Do-hyun went into the bathroom. He turned on the hot water. He stood under the shower and felt every drop. In his past life, he'd forgotten what a hot shower felt like by the end of the first month of winter. He stood there for a long time, maybe 20 minutes, maybe 30. Then he stepped out, dried himself off, put on clean clothes, lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. His mind was racing like a conveyor belt. Money. He had about 4 million won in his account. Peanuts by normal standards. But he could take out a consumer loan, the maximum amount. The banks would check his credit history and approve it because he had a steady job and no debts. In 3 months, there wouldn't be any banks left. There'd be no one to pay the loan back to. This wasn't theft, it was math. The warehouse. He needed to figure out how this space worked. What could be put in there? How much fits? How to retrieve things? He reached into the void next to the bed and felt the cool edge of an invisible opening. The storage space opened. Do-hyun picked up an empty noodle bowl from the table and placed it inside. The bowl vanished from his hand. He closed his eyes and saw it. A mental table. 1 row. Item number. Ceramic cup. Weight. 200 grams. Date stored. Today. He reached out again and thought about the cup. It appeared in his palm. Warm. As if it had never disappeared. Do-hyun lay back down. The first test was complete. Tomorrow, he'll take the second one. He rolled onto his side and, for the first time in a very long time, closed his eyes without fear. Outside, the world was still asleep. Outside, it was warm. Outside, people were making plans for the weekend and arguing over parking spots. Do-hyun had other plans. Exactly 90 days. And he wouldn't waste a single one. The morning began with the alarm clock, the usual electronic beep at 6:30. Do-hyun opened his eyes and, for 2 seconds, couldn't remember which life he was in. Then he saw the crack in the ceiling, and it all came back to him. He got up, got dressed. An old jacket, jeans, work sneakers. He picked up his phone and checked the date. October 4th, Wednesday. 89 days left until day 0. He opened his banking app. 3,800,000 won in his account. Nothing. Dust. But he doesn't need the money today. Today he had the evening shift at the supermarket warehouse. The shift for clearing out expired items. Do-hyun stepped out of his apartment and closed the door. Emma was standing on the landing, his neighbor from the apartment across the hall. An American woman with red hair and a broad smile. She was holding a trash bag and turned toward him. She said, "Good morning," in broken Korean and smiled. Do-hyun froze. The last time he'd seen Emma in his past life, she'd been standing by the entrance with a single backpack. They'd kicked her out into the freezing cold, -50, because she was a foreigner and there was no place for outsiders here. She hadn't cried then. She just stood there, staring at the closed door. He wanted to go out after her, but 4 pairs of hands were holding him back. He never found out what became of her. Now, she was standing right in front of him, alive, warm, smelling of coffee and some kind of floral shampoo. Do-hyun swallowed and replied, "Good morning." His voice didn't waver. He'd learned not to show it. He had to learn. Emma asked if he was all right because he looked pale. He said he hadn't slept well and walked toward the elevator. In the elevator, he pressed his forehead against the cold wall and clenched his fists. 89 days. In 89 days, he'd take her away from here. This time, no one would kick her out. Do-hyun stepped out of the building. It was a warm morning. The October sun hung over the rooftops of the 9-story buildings and warmed his back. People were heading to work. School children were running toward the bus. Mina was sitting on the swings in the courtyard. A little girl of about 7 in a pink jacket with a bear-shaped backpack. She was waiting for her mom, who would come out in 5 minutes and take her to school. In her past life, Mina had survived the first 3 months. Then he stopped receiving information because he himself had died. He didn't know if she was alive. Do-hyun looked away and walked to the bus stop. Today he had to work as usual, smile as usual, be that same quiet, polite Do-hyun whom his bosses remember by his last name and his co-workers remember for being the only one left on the night shift. It was still too early for any sudden moves. He arrived at work around 9. The supermarket warehouse in Incheon's industrial zone, a concrete building, a loading dock, the smell of cardboard and melted ice cream from a malfunctioning freezer. Everything was just as it had been. Do-hyun changed into his work clothes in the break room and stepped out into the warehouse. Shift supervisor Kim Chang-soo was standing at the counter with a tablet, checking something. Do-hyun walked over and said hello. Mr. Kim looked at him over his glasses and nodded. He asked how things were going. Do-hyun said everything was fine and asked to be scheduled for the evening write-off shift this Friday. Kim was surprised. Usually, no one asked for the evening write-off shift. It was the most tedious job. 3 hours of sorting through expired items, filling out reports, and loading them into the truck. Do-hyun said he needed the extra hours. Kim shrugged and agreed. Do-hyun worked the day shift like a machine. His hands remembered every movement: scanner, pallet, forklift, route through the warehouse from Zone A to Zone G. His body worked while his brain calculated. Rice, 25-kilogram bags. They'd need at least 200 bags for the first year for 20 people. That's 5 metric tons. Salt, 10 kilograms per person per year. 200 kilograms. Sugar, about the same amount. Vegetable oil, 5 liters per person per year. 100 liters. Canned meat, 1 400-gram can. 1 can a day for 20 people is 20 cans. 7,300 cans a year. That's a lot. That's a lot for one man in an old jacket. But he has the warehouse, and the warehouse has the doubling effect. Do-hyun stopped in the middle of the aisle between the shelves and closed his eyes. He did the math. If he puts a sack of rice in the warehouse on Monday, by Thursday the sack will double. 2 sacks. Another 72 hours later. 4 sacks. Another 72 hours later. 8. In a month, 1 sack would turn into hundreds. Provided the sack was obtained honestly. Stolen goods don't double. Goods taken from a corpse don't double. Only those that were bought. Those received as a gift. Those taken with explicit permission. The warehouse encourages honesty. Do-hyun opened his eyes and went back to work. Yoongi's co-worker approached him during lunch break and asked if he wanted to go for a beer after his shift. Do-hyun politely declined. In his past life, Yoongi had disappeared during the second week of winter. He simply didn't show up for work. No one knew what had happened to him. Maybe he froze to death. Maybe he left town. Not the kind of person you need to save. Not the kind of person you can just write off. Just a stranger whose name he knew. His shift ended at 6. Do-hyun changed his clothes and left. Instead of going home, he went to the bank. He applied for a personal loan. The manager checked his information. Steady job. Clean credit history. Regular payments. Approved. 15 million won at 11% per year. 3-year repayment term. Do-hyun signed the papers and left. 3 years. In 3 months, the bank won't exist anymore. In 3 years, there won't be an economy in which the word loan makes any sense. But his conscience didn't prick him. He isn't stealing. He's taking out a loan according to the rules written by the bankers themselves. What happens to those rules in 90 days isn't his responsibility. He returned home and sat at the table with a notebook until nightfall. He wrote lists: food, medicine, tools, clothing, fuel, seeds, books. Each item calculated for 20 people and 7 years. 7 years. That's exactly how long the long winter lasted in his past life. He didn't know if it would last that long this time, but he had to prepare for the worst. At 3 in the morning, he set the notebook aside. 23 pages of fine handwriting. He reread the first page. Rice, 200 sacks. Flour, 50 sacks. Salt, 200 kilograms. Sugar, 200 kilograms. Vegetable oil, 100 liters. Canned meat, 3,000 cans. Canned fish, 2,000 cans. Assorted grains, 500 kilograms. Pasta, 300 kilograms. Powdered milk, 100 kilograms. Honey, 50 kilograms. Tea, 30 caregivers. Coffee, 20 kilograms. Next came the medicines: broad-spectrum antibiotics, painkillers, antiseptics, bandages and band-aids. fever reducers, blood pressure medication, heart medication, insulin, syringes, surgical sutures, scalpels. Do-hyun underlined the line with the heart medication. For Min-so. She takes the pills but forgets to refill her prescription herself. In his past life, he found out about this too late. This time, he'll buy her a 5-year supply. It was Friday. The evening shift was in charge of inventory. Do-hyun arrived at the warehouse by 7 in the evening. He put on his work uniform. He grabbed his tablet and headed to the expired goods section. 12 pallets, rice nearing its expiration date, sugar, salt, vegetable oil, canned goods, pasta, coffee, tea, baby food, diapers, sanitary pads, toilet paper. According to regulations, all of this was written off and sent for disposal. In reality, the employees took half of it for themselves. Everyone knew this, including management. Do-hyun approached Kim. Kim was sitting in his chair, drinking coffee from a thermos. A tired, kind man in his 50s. A wife, 2 kids, a mortgage. Do-hyun asked him to give him all the write-offs for that week. Kim raised an eyebrow. All of it. 12 pallets. Do-hyun said his wife was pregnant and wanted to make pickles, but they were short on money. Kim looked at him for about 3 seconds. Then he waved his hand and said, "Take it, kid. It's going to the dump anyway." Do-hyun signed the disposal form. Neatly. Legibly. Like an honest logistics specialist. Under the watchful eye of the cameras, he loaded all 12 pallets into his old bongo. The truck sagged on its springs but held up. He drove out of the warehouse. According to the paperwork, this was written-off merchandise officially received with the permission of the person in charge of inventory. Everything was above board. Do-hyun drove home. He parked the bongo in the courtyard. He waited until 2 a.m. when the courtyard was empty. He went out to the car and began transferring the pallets to the warehouse. One sweep of his arm, a bag of rice disappears into an invisible opening. Another movement, a box of canned goods. Another one, a can of oil. He worked for 40 minutes. No noise, no flashes, just a quiet guy in an old jacket unloading a car in the yard. When the last box disappeared into the warehouse, Do-hyun closed his eyes and looked at the mental tally. 12 pallets, 300 kilograms of rice, 50 kilograms of sugar, 80 kilograms of salt, 40 liters of oil, 480 cans of preserves, and so on down the list. Stock date, Friday. Next doubling date, Monday. In 72 hours, all of this will double. And then again. And there's more. By the end of the first week, he'll have a year's worth of food for 10 people. All for a single signature and a polite smile. Do-hyun got into the empty bongo. He put his hands on the steering wheel and laughed very quietly. For the first time in 2 lifetimes. Monday. Do-hyun woke up at 5 in the morning and closed his eyes right away. The mental inventory of the warehouse had updated. Every line had doubled. Rice, 600 kilograms. Sugar, 100 kilograms. Salt, 160 kilograms. Oil, 80 liters. Canned goods, 960 cans. He lay there, gazing at these numbers with his mind's eye. It works. In 72 hours, there'll be twice as much. In a week, 4 times as much. The math of exponential growth, the most beautiful thing a logistics specialist knows. But he couldn't wait. Doubling only works with what's been bought or obtained honestly. So he had to buy. A lot and fast. While there was still money. While there are still stores. While the world hasn't frozen over yet. Do-hyun got up, got dressed, left the house and got into the bongo. First stop, the Incheon Market Wholesale Warehouse. A huge hangar with rows of shelves. He arrived at opening time at 7 in the morning and was third in line. He pulled the list out of his pocket and got started. Rice, 50 25-kilogram bags. Flour, 20 10-kilogram bags. Sugar, 20 bags. Salt, 30 bags. Grains, buckwheat, oats, barley, all in bags. The salesman behind the counter looked at him with interest. He asked if he was opening a restaurant. Do-hyun said he was helping the church at the temple collect food for a winter charity program. The clerk nodded and gave him a discount. Do-hyun loaded the bongo under the roof. He drove around the corner of the hangar where there were no cameras and transferred everything to the warehouse in 3 minutes. He returned. He loaded up some more. Vegetable oil, 5 boxes of 20 bottles each, vinegar, soy sauce, dried seaweed, dried mushrooms, canned beans, sesame oil, pepper, spices, anything that could be stored for a long time. Although at the warehouse, shelf life doesn't matter. Stasis. Time doesn't pass inside. Meat doesn't spoil. Bread doesn't go stale. Hot soup will still be just as hot a month from now. But the world doesn't know that yet. The world doesn't know anything yet. Second stop, the farmer's market in Ansan, an hour's drive from Incheon. Do-hyun arrived around 10, an autumn market. grandmothers in rubber boots behind stalls of fruits and vegetables. He walked from row to row and made his purchases. Potatoes, 100 kilograms. Carrots, 50. Onions, 50. Garlic, 20. Napa cabbage, 30 heads. Fresh eggs, 10 boxes of 30 each. Honey, 21 kilogram jars. Then he found an old woman selling strawberries. Late fall strawberries, red and smelling of summer. The old woman was sitting at a small table with 4 trays. Do-hyun asked how many she had. The old woman was surprised. 20 kilograms in the trunk of her car. Do-hyun said he'd take it all. The grandmother looked at him very intently. She asked why he needed so much. Do-hyun said his wife was pregnant. The grandmother broke into a smile. She said she'd throw in another 5 kilograms for free because a pregnant woman needs plenty of vitamins. Do-hyun thanked her. He loaded the strawberries into the bongo. 25 kilograms of fresh strawberries that, in 4 months, would become a cake for Hana's birthday. In a world where strawberries would die out in the first week of winter. He sat in the car, holding the last tray in his hands. He opened the lid. The strawberries lay in neat rows, red, alive, smelling of the sun that would soon be gone. Do-hyun closed the lid and took the tray to the warehouse. Third stop, the pharmacy. Not just one, he'd visited 7 pharmacies that day. At each one, he bought a little bit so as not to arouse suspicion. Antibiotics, amoxicillin, azithromycin, ciprofloxacin, painkillers, ibuprofen, acetaminophen, antiseptics, chlorhexidine, iodine, hydrogen peroxide, bandages, band-aids, tourniquets, syringes, fever reducers, antihistamines, vitamins, and separately, at a specialty pharmacy, by prescription, metoprolol, a heart medication. He brought a prescription he'd found online and printed out on his own printer. The pharmacist checked it. He looked at it. Do-hyun said it was for his mother. The pharmacist sold him 3 packages. Do-hyun visited 3 more pharmacies and bought 9 more packages. 12 packages of metoprolol. 1 pill a day, that's a year's supply. If he doubles the dose, in 3 weeks it'll be enough for 5 years. For Min-soo, who forgets to fill her own prescriptions and takes care of everyone but herself. Fourth stop, a hunting and fishing store. Do-hyun had never been to a store like this before. In his past life, he didn't even know how to open a can with a knife. He walked in and stopped. The walls were lined with knives, axes, tents, sleeping bags, and thermoses. Behind the counter stood a bearded man in a camouflage vest. Do-hyun approached and said he needed gear for a winter expedition. A long one, several months. The salesman perked up. He showed him around the store for 2 hours. Do-hyun bought 4 winter sleeping bags rated for -40, 10 sets of thermal underwear in various sizes, 3 tents, 2 gas stoves, 20 gas canisters, a toolkit, axes, knives, ropes, carabiners, flashlights, batteries, lots of batteries, 4 boxes, and separately, a portable radio, an amateur kit. The salesman asked if he had a license. Do-hyun said he'd get one. The salesman shrugged. Do-hyun paid and loaded everything into the bongo. That evening, he sat at home and tallied up his expenses. In a single day, he'd spent 3,200,000 won. He had about 15,600,000 left, counting his loan and the balance in his account. 87 days until day 0. He opened his notebook. He crossed off what he'd bought. He added new items. Books. He needed books. Not fiction. Practical ones. Indoor gardening. Hydroponics for beginners. Field surgery. First aid. Veterinary medicine. Electrical engineering for dummies. Construction and repair. Food preservation. These books were cheap, but weighed a lot. In the warehouse, weight doesn't matter. Do-hyun set aside his notebook and closed his eyes. He looked at the warehouse chart. The rows were multiplying. Item numbers were lining up in rows. He mentally sorted everything into zones. Zone A, food. Zone B, medicines. Zone C, equipment and tools. Zone D, hygiene and household goods. Zone E, currently empty, for seeds. A B-C analysis. Category A, critically important. Rice, salt, water, antibiotics. Category B, important. Canned goods, grains, tools. Category C, useful. Spices, coffee, books, strawberries. He smiled at the last line. Strawberries in Category C. Useful, not critically important. But for Hana, who will turn 23 in 4 months, in a world without electricity and without hope, these strawberries will be more important than any sack of rice. Because rice means survival. But a birthday cake with strawberries is a reason to survive. Do-hyun went to bed. Outside the window, rain was drizzling. Warm October rain. In 3 months, there would be snow instead of rain. Snow that wouldn't stop for 9 years. A week had passed. Do-hyun was living a double life. By day, he was a quiet logistics worker in a supermarket warehouse. He scanned merchandise. He moved pallets. He said, "Yes, Mr. Kim." He said, "All right, Mr. Kim." He smiled at his coworkers. He ate lunch alone in the break room. In the evenings and on weekends, he turned into a different person. Focused, precise, and quick. A man with a checklist and a timer in his head. In his first week, he visited 4 wholesale distribution centers, 2 home improvement stores, 12 pharmacies, 3 home appliance stores, 2 bookstores, and 1 fabric store. The warehouse was growing. The list of items got longer every day. The doubling mechanism worked flawlessly. Every 72 hours, a quiet click, and the rows in the list would double. By the end of the first week, he had over a metric ton of rice, 400 kilograms of flour, 200 liters of oil, 2,000 cans of preserved food, a mountain of medicine, 3 complete sets of tools, and 25 kilograms of strawberries that smelled of summer and were waiting for their moment. But the shopping was only the beginning. Do-hyun needed a fortress. In his past life, he'd learned about the bomb shelter beneath the old chemical plant on the outskirts of Incheon too late. It was the 4th month of winter, when he could no longer walk due to frostbite. One of the survivors had mentioned it in passing. An underground warehouse, 2-meter-thick concrete walls, ventilation, an independent water well, built in the 60s in case of a nuclear strike, abandoned after perestroika. It stood empty and unwanted. Do-hyun thought at the time that it was the perfect place, and he died 3 days later. In this life, he would be the first to go there. Saturday. Do-hyun got into his bongo and drove to the outskirts of the city, an industrial zone, abandoned chemical plant buildings, rusty gates, shattered windows. The grounds were overgrown with weeds and low shrubs. He stopped the car at a side entrance and got out. It smelled of wet concrete and old iron. Do-hyun walked around the perimeter of the grounds. 3 buildings, the administrative building, the production building, and the warehouse. Behind the warehouse, dug into the ground, he found what he was looking for. A concrete staircase leading underground. A heavy steel door, rusty but intact. The lock had been forced open. Do-hyun pushed the door. It swung open with a long, creaking sound. Steps leading down. Darkness. He pulled a flashlight from his pocket. The beam illuminated a concrete corridor. Dry, clean. No water, no mold. The walls were thick. He walked down, counting the steps. 23 steps. Then a horizontal corridor about 15 meters long. Then another door. Open. Beyond it, a large space. Do-hyun stepped inside and swept the flashlight around. A large hall, about 200 square meters. A concrete ceiling 3 meters high. Shelving ran along the walls, empty, rusty but sturdy. In the far corner was a door leading to the next room. He walked on. 3 more rooms, smaller ones, about 40 meters each. In one, he found an old ventilation shaft. It was working. There was a draft. Air was rising upward. In another room stood a well pump, hand-operated, cast iron. Do-hyun pulled the lever. It creaked. Water began to flow from the pipe, murky at first, then clear. He cupped his hands and sniffed it. Odorless, pure groundwater. He sat down on the concrete floor in the middle of the main hall and turned off his flashlight. Darkness. Absolute silence. Only the sound of water dripping from the well. 400 square meters of underground space. Concrete walls that won't freeze even at -60. Ventilation. Water. Shelving units. 2 entrances. 1 main and 1 emergency exit, which he would still have to find. A fortress. There it was. Do-hyun turned on his flashlight and spent the next 3 hours examining every centimeter of the shelter. No cracks in the walls. The ceiling was intact. The electrical wiring was dead, but the cable channels were still in place. The drainage system was working. The floors were level. He found the emergency exit in the 3rd room, a hatch in the ceiling, a staircase leading up, an exit to the surface 100 meters from the main entrance, camouflaged by shrubs. Perfect. On Monday, he went to City Hall. He survived an application for a long-term lease of the underground space at the former chemical plant. The clerk behind the counter looked at him in bewilderment. He asked why he needed this basement. Do-hyun said he wanted to use it as a storage space for antiques. He runs an online store selling vintage items and needs a dry, cool space. The official checked the database. The property was on the city's books. No one wanted it. No one was claiming it. Do-hyun requested a 49-year lease. The official grunted. He did the math. He named the amount, 200,000 won per year. Do-hyun paid 2 years in advance, 400,000 won for the fortress that, in 3 months, would become the only safe place within a 10-kilometer radius. He received the contract, the keys, and he walked out of the building very calmly. Over the next 2 weeks, Do-hyun moved his belongings to the fortress. Not from the warehouse. He didn't take anything out of the warehouse. Everything in the warehouse multiplies, and it mustn't be touched before it's time. He brought other things he'd bought separately. A generator, a quiet 5-kilowatt diesel generator, heavy as sin. He found it on a classifieds website and bought it from a farmer for 1.5 million won. The farmer helped load it into the bongo. Solar panels, 4 of them. Batteries, wires, circuit breakers, outlets, electric heaters, 3 of them. Kerosene lamps, 10 of them. Kerosene, 200 liters. In canisters, chimney pipes, insulation, mineral wool, in rolls. Do-hyun worked every evening after his main shift. He'd drive to the fortress, go downstairs, haul things up, install them. His hands were covered in calluses, his back ached, but he didn't stop. He needed to prepare at least 2 living quarters, a first aid station, a kitchen, a storage area for supplies. This wasn't a luxury. It was the bare minimum to keep 20 people from freezing during the first week. At the same time, he began to think about the people. Minsu, Ari, Jiyu, Han, Emma, Soyeon. 6 names in the left column, 6 people he had to bring to the fortress before day 0. But he couldn't just walk up to each of them and say that in 3 months the world would freeze over. They'd think he was crazy, or a cultist, or a con artist. He needed a different approach, a gentle one, a natural one. He had to enter their lives in such a way that, when the time came, they would go with him, not because they believed in the end of the world, but because they believed in him. Do-hyun opened his notebook to the page with the names, and next to each one, he began to write, where is she now? What she does? What she loves? What she's afraid of? And how he could be near her without arousing suspicion. First, Hana Yoon, the closest of all. She works as a cashier at his own supermarket. He sees her every day, a quiet girl in an apron with a name tag. She carries an agronomy textbook with her. He remembers that in his past life, he used to help her carry those textbooks to the bus. He could start with that. Just be there. Just be the person who notices she's there. Hana was standing at checkout lane number 4. Monday, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Few customers. She was sitting on a high stool, reading her textbook with it tucked under the counter so the floor manager wouldn't see it. Do-hyun watched her from behind the shelf of cleaning supplies. In his past life, he hadn't thought about her. She was just a cashier, a quiet student who greeted him every morning and thanked him for his help when he helped her carry her textbooks. Then the world froze, and she told him straight to his face that his kindness would be his downfall. She was the only one who told the truth, and she died in the 2nd month of winter, protecting her grandmother from people who had ceased to be human. Now she's 22, shy, a bookworm, with dark circles under her eyes from night shifts and studying. Her hair is pulled back in a ponytail. On her wrist, a cheap watch with a cracked face. She's not the kind of person people notice. She's the kind who notices others. Do-hyun took a bottle of dish soap from the shelf and walked to checkout lane number 4. Hana looked up. She saw him. She smiled. Good afternoon, Mr. So, she said. Do-hyun placed the bottle on the conveyor belt and said, Good afternoon. Then he nodded toward the textbook under the counter and asked what she was reading today. Hana blushed slightly. She admitted it was the chapter on hydroponics, growing plants without soil in a nutrient solution. Do-hyun said it sounded interesting. Hana looked at him in surprise. Usually, when she talked about agronomy, people would change the subject. Or they'd joke that she should give up those garden beds and get a real job. Do-hyun wasn't joking. He said he'd always believed that people who know how to grow food are more important than those who know how to sell it. Hana blinked. She scanned the bottle of detergent. She named the price. Do-hyun paid. As he was leaving, he turned around and said that if she needed help carrying her textbooks to the bus after her shift, he'd be at the warehouse until 7. Hana nodded. She didn't say anything. But as he walked away, he saw in the reflection of the glass door that she was watching him go. At 7 in the evening, Do-hyun left the warehouse. Hana was standing at the bus stop with a backpack from which her textbooks were sticking out. 2 thick volumes, Greenhouse Horticulture and Fundamentals of Soil Science. Do-hyun walked over and took both textbooks out of her backpack. Hana started to say it wasn't necessary, that she could manage on her own. He said it was on his way. That was a lie. He was headed the other way. They waited for the bus, and Hana was silent for the first 2 minutes. Then she began to speak, quietly, as if she wasn't used to anyone listening. She told him she was studying to be an agronomist in the evening program and working as a cashier to pay for her tuition. Her parents think agronomy is pointless. Her mother wants her to become an accountant. Her father doesn't understand at all why she needs a college education. Her grandmother is the only one who supports her. Her grandmother has grown vegetables on her own plot her whole life and says that the earth is the only thing that won't let you down. Do-hyun listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't give any advice. He just listened. The bus pulled up. He handed her the textbooks. He said he could help her again tomorrow if she needed it. Hana took the textbooks. She stood there for a second. Then she said, "Thank you, Mr. So. You're the first person at work who's ever asked what I'm reading." The bus took her away. Do-hyun stood at the bus stop and watched the red lights of the departing bus. In his past life, he hadn't noticed Hana. She was just part of the background, cashier number 4, a quiet girl with textbooks. He didn't know she knew about hydroponics. He didn't know she knew at what temperature Napa cabbage sprouts. He didn't know she was the only one who would tell him the truth to his face. And by the time he found out, it was too late. This time, he got a head start. For the next 2 weeks, Do-hyun met Hana every evening after her shift. He carried her textbooks. He listened. He asked questions, not about her personal life, but about agronomy, hydroponics, seeds, and growth cycles. Hana lit up when she talked about these things. Her voice grew more confident. Her eyes would light up. She'd pull out a notebook and draw diagrams of irrigation systems right there at the bus stop. Do-hyun memorized every word. Not because he was pretending, because in 3 months, this knowledge would be worth more than gold. Hydroponics, growing food without soil, underground, under artificial lighting. This is what would save the fortress from starvation when the supplies at the warehouse stopped seeming endless. At the same time, Do-hyun began to get closer to Ari, the barista at the coffee shop next to the warehouse. Every morning before his shift, he'd stop by to get an Americano from her. A small coffee shop with 5 tables, the smell of roasted beans, music from a cheap speaker. Ari stood behind the counter with her purple hair, wearing an apron with cats painted on it. She smiled at every customer, but her smile for Do-hyun was special, the kind she reserved for regulars. She knew he ordered his Americano without sugar. She knew he came in at 7:15. She knew his name. In a past life, Do-hyun had stopped by every morning for 3 years straight. They'd say hello, exchange a few words. Once, during the first month of winter, when the coffee shop was still running on autopilot, Ari silently poured him a double shot. She didn't charge him extra. She just looked him in the eyes and nodded slightly. He never saw her again. He found out later that the coffee shop had been burned down during the second week of winter. Now Ari was standing right in front of him, alive, drawing a little flower on his cup with a marker. She always did that. She drew on cups, flowers, cats, funny faces. Once he saw her draw a customer's portrait on a napkin. A quick sketch, so lifelike it was uncanny. Ari was an artist, a real one, but she didn't believe it herself. Do-hyun knew why. Her parents had told her whole life that art wasn't serious, that she needed to find a normal job, that drawing was a hobby, not a profession. By the time she was 24, Ari had almost given up. The coffee shop was a temporary stopover before she became a normal office worker. Do-hyun couldn't let that happen. Not because he cared about her creative path, but because in the world after day 0, beauty would become a luxury that couldn't be bought. Ari's paintings would be the only splash of color in the fortress, where the walls were made of gray concrete and beyond the door lay a white void. He started small. Every morning when he bought coffee, he'd say something about her drawings. Not flattery, not empty compliments, specific things. He said that yesterday's cat on his cup was better than the one from the day before because it had lively eyes. Ari laughed and said he was the first customer to notice the difference between the 2 drawn cats. Do-hyun said it was hard not to notice when one was looking right through you and the other was looking right at you. Ari stopped laughing. She looked at him seriously. Then she said he was strange, but in a good way. A week later, Do-hyun walked into the coffee shop after hours. Ari was sitting at a table in the back, drawing in a small notebook. She quickly closed it when she saw Do-hyun, as if she were embarrassed. He sat down at the next table and didn't say anything about the notebook. He just ordered coffee and took out his own notebook with calculations. They sat side by side in silence, each engrossed in their own notebook. 20 minutes later, Ari asked what he was writing. Do-hyun said he was figuring out how much food 20 people would need for a year. She raised her eyebrows. She asked why. He said he was preparing for winter. She laughed and said that winter was still 2 months away and he probably didn't need that much food. Do-hyun looked her in the eyes and said that this winter would be different. He said it calmly, without drama, without trying to convince her. Ari stopped laughing. She looked at him. Then she opened her sketchbook and showed him a drawing. A city covered in snow. Houses buried up to their roofs. People as small as dots. A gray sky without a sun. She said she'd drawn it last night. She didn't know why. She'd had a strange dream. Do-hyun looked at the drawing. The city in the drawing was Incheon. She had drawn his neighborhood, his house, a swing in the yard covered in snow all the way up to the crossbar. He looked away and said it was a beautiful drawing. Ari closed her notebook. She said quietly that she'd felt scared while drawing it, as if it weren't a figment of her imagination but a memory. Do-hyun didn't say anything. He finished his coffee. He stood up. As he left, he placed a business card on the table, his phone number. He'd written it on the back. "If you get scared, call me. I'll come get you." Ari took the card. She twirled it between her fingers. She put it in her apron pocket. Do-hyun walked out of the coffee shop. 2 out of 6. Hana and Ari. Neither of them knows yet why he's around. Both still think he's just a polite co-worker. But the thread is already taut.
And when the world starts to crumble, he'll pull on it, and they'll follow him. Not because he'll tell them the truth, but because he'll turn out to be the only one who didn't lie. Do-hyun stood at the door to apartment 703, hesitating to ring the bell. Emma Carter lived behind that door, an American, an English teacher, a neighbor on the same floor. The woman who, in a past life, had shared her last ration with him when everyone else had turned their backs on him. He could hear music playing from behind the door, something American, country music. Emma was homesick. She was always homesick. She missed her mom in Ohio, her dad, who fixed tractors, her younger brother, who was in college. She'd come to Korea 3 years ago to teach English at a private school, and stayed because the contract was good, and going home would mean admitting she'd failed. Do-hyun knew almost everything about her, not because he was spying on her, because in a past life, they'd been neighbors for 3 years, and they'd spent the last 2 months of her life together in the stairwell. She'd told him about herself between serving bowls of soup from the communal pot. He remembered every word. She loves peanut butter and misses it more than she misses hot water. She's afraid of dogs, but pretends she isn't. She bakes cookies when she's nervous. She's allergic to penicillin. She's kept a diary every day since she was 14. She cries when she hears a certain song, but has never said which one. Do-hyun pressed the doorbell. The music faded. Footsteps. The door opened. Emma was standing there in sweatpants and a t-shirt with the Ohio University logo. Her hair was pulled back into a bun. She was holding a wooden spoon. It smelled like cinnamon. She was baking cookies. That meant she was nervous. Emma saw him and smiled. "Hi, neighbor," she said. Do-hyun said, "Hi." He said he could smell something baking and wanted to ask if everything was okay. Emma laughed. She said she was just missing home. Fall reminds her of Ohio, the yellow leaves and all that. She asked if he'd like to come in for some cookies. Do-hyun said yes. Emma's apartment was a mirror image of his own. The same walls, the same layout, but a different world. Bright pillows on the couch, photos on the walls, family, friends, Ohio landscapes, a bookshelf with books in English. In the kitchen, a baking sheet full of cookies, oatmeal with chocolate chips. She set a plate and a cup of tea in front of him. He took a bite of a cookie. Real. Homemade. Soft on the inside and crispy on the outside. In a past life, Emma had baked the same cookies in the 3rd week of winter, using the last of the flour and the last of the eggs. She handed one out to everyone. She didn't keep any for herself. He ate and listened as she talked about her students. About a boy who speaks English better than Korean but is shy around his classmates. About a girl who writes poems in English and hides them in her desk. Emma spoke quickly, jumping from topic to topic. That's how people talk when they have no one else to talk to. Do-hyun asked how often she called her mom. Emma fell silent. She stirred her tea. She said once a week, on Sundays. Her mom always asks when she'll come back. She always says soon. They both know that's not true. Do-hyun nodded. He didn't say anything. Then he asked if she had any close friends here. Not coworkers. Friends. The kind you can call at 3 a.m. Emma looked at him. She paused. She said no. She has coworkers. She has acquaintances. But friends? She shook her head. It's hard to make friends in a foreign country. You sort of learn the language. You sort of understand the culture, but you always remain just a little bit on the outside. Just a little bit out of place. Do-hyun set his cup down on the table. He looked her in the eyes and said that if she ever needed help, any kind of help, at any time, she could knock on his door or give him a call. He was serious. Emma smiled. She said thank you. She said he was the kindest neighbor she'd ever met in Korea. Do-hyun stood up and walked to the door. Emma pressed a paper bag of cookies into his hands. She told him to take them. She'd baked too many. He took the bag. He walked out. He closed the door. He stood in the hallway, holding the warm bag of cookies. In a past life, Emma had given him the last thing she had. Cookies.
warm cookies made from her last batch of flour, and for that, she'd been thrown out into the cold. Because she was a foreigner. Because she was an outsider. Do-hyun pressed the bag to his chest and walked back to his apartment. 3 out of 6. Hana, Ari, Emma. 3 remained. Minsu, Ji-yu, So-yeon. Minsu was next. The local clinic was a 15-minute drive away. Do-hyun arrived at 4 and made an appointment with a general practitioner. He didn't need a general practitioner. He needed an excuse to go inside the building, the clinic. A long hallway, the smell of antiseptic and old linoleum, a line of elderly women, crying children, nurses rushing around with folders. Do-hyun sat in the hallway and waited. He knew that Minso worked on the second floor, the treatment room. She gives injections, draws blood, sets up IVs, and comforts the elderly who are afraid of needles. In his past life, he'd come to her with frostbitten fingers in the second month of winter. The clinic was still open, but now it charged a fee, not in money, but in food. 1 consultation, 1 can of stewed meat. All the doctors and nurses took extra payments, all except Min's. She looked at his hands, treated them, bandaged them, and said, "Come back tomorrow, I'll check how they're healing." He asked how much he owed. She shook her head. Then she secretly slipped her lunch, a rice ball wrapped in a napkin, into his pocket. He ate it on the street and burst into tears at the taste of hot rice, which he hadn't eaten in 2 weeks. She died in her 5th month, protecting a patient from looters. 3 men broke into the clinic looking for medicine. Minsu stood between them and an old man on an IV drip. They hit her. She didn't fall. They hit her again. She fell and never got up again. Do-hyun found out about it a week later. By then, he himself could no longer walk. Now he was sitting in the clinic hallway and could hear her voice. She was talking to someone in the office. A quiet, calm voice. That very voice. The voice of a person who, in a panic, becomes calmer rather than louder. The door to the treatment room opened. An elderly woman with a bandaged elbow came out. Behind her was Minsu, 27 years old, thin, dark circles under her eyes, her hair tucked under a medical cap, a white lab coat a size too big, a weary smile. She saw Do-hyun in the hallway and their eyes met. She didn't recognize him. They'd never met in this life. Do-hyun stood up and walked over to her. He said he had an appointment but had gone to the wrong room. He asked where the general practitioner was. Minso pointed to the right, down the hallway. He thanked her. He went to see the general practitioner. He waited his turn. He went in. He complained of headaches. He got a prescription for ibuprofen. He left. Minsu had already finished her shift. He saw her as he was leaving the clinic. She was standing on the porch, drinking coffee from a paper cup. Alone. No colleagues. No friends. Alone. Do-hyun approached her. He said he was the guy who'd gone to the wrong office. Minsu nodded. She remembered. Do-hyun said he wanted to thank her and offered her a ride if it was on her way. He had a car. Minso looked at him appraisingly. She was used to sizing people up quickly. In her line of work, it was a necessity. She saw before her a quiet guy in an old jacket with a polite face and tired eyes. He didn't seem dangerous. She said she lived in Bupyeong. Do-hyun said it was almost on his way. That was another lie. They got into the bongo. Minso buckled her seatbelt and said she usually didn't get into cars with men she didn't know. Do-hyun said that was sensible. She smiled wryly. He drove her home. 20 minutes in traffic. Minsu was silent for the first 5 minutes. Then she asked what he did for a living. He said he worked as a logistics specialist at a warehouse. She nodded. She asked if he liked it. He said it was just a job. Not good, not bad, just a job. She said she understood, that her job was the same, just a job. Only after her shift, her hands shake from exhaustion, and she falls asleep before she even reaches her bed. Do-hyun asked how long it had been since she'd taken her pills. Minso froze. She turned to face him. She asked what kind of pills. Do-hyun realized he'd made a mistake. He knew about her heart medication from her past life. She'd told him herself, 3 months after they met in the other world. In this world, they'd seen each other just 10 minutes ago. He quickly said he'd noticed the name tag on her robe and thought that nurses often forget about themselves. Just a general observation. Minsu relaxed. She said it was true. Doctors are the worst patients. She knows this from her own experience. Do-hyun drove her home. She got out. She thanked him. He gave her his business card. He said that if she needed help with anything, he was always available. Minsu took the card. She looked at him. She said he was a strange man. Do-hyun said he'd been told that before. She almost smiled. She went into the building. Do-hyun sat in the car and watched the door close. 4 out of 6. 73 days remained until day 0. Ji Han worked for a refrigeration equipment maintenance company. The office was on the industrial outskirts of Incheon, a white building behind an iron fence. Do-hyun knew the address because the same company serviced the freezers at his supermarket. In her past life, Ji-yu used to visit the warehouse once a quarter. She'd check the compressors, change the filters, complain about poorly laid wires. A small, wiry woman in work overalls with short cropped hair and a cigarette perpetually tucked behind her ear. She spoke more gently to the equipment than to people. She'd stroke the pipes and tell them everything would be all right. Then she'd turn to the staff and say that if they overloaded the third circuit one more time, she'd personally shove them into the freezer. Do-hyun would stand off to the side and say nothing. She didn't notice him. He was just another logistics worker in a blue uniform. But one day, 2 months before day 0 in his first life, he tried to warn people. Something was driving him. He started telling his co-workers that the winter would be terrible, that they needed to stock up, that he'd read about anomalies in the atmosphere. Everyone laughed. They tapped their fingers against their temples. The guy had lost his mind. Ji-yu was in the warehouse that day. She was changing the filter in chamber number 2. She overheard his conversation with a co-worker. She walked over, looked at him, and said one sentence. "It makes sense. You're a fool for not preparing yourself." Then she left. She didn't help him, didn't support him, didn't give him advice. She just told him the truth, just like Hana, only harsher. Ji-yu died in the first week of winter. She got stuck in the elevator of a skyscraper that had lost power. The elevator became an icy coffin. Now Do-hyun needed to get to her, but not through the warehouse. The quarterly inspection was in a month. He couldn't wait. He called her company. He said that the second compressor in their warehouse was malfunctioning and asked them to send a technician, preferably someone who had serviced them before. The dispatcher said he'd send whoever was available. Do-hyun insisted. He said the previous technician knew their system and it would save time. The dispatcher sighed. He checked. He said Han Ji-yu was available on Thursday. Thursday, 10 in the morning. The company's white van pulled up to the warehouse ramp. The door opened. Ji-yu stepped out. Overalls, short hair, a cigarette tucked behind her ear, a tool bag that weighed more than she did. She looked at the warehouse like a surgeon looking at a patient, with professional calm and a hint of irritation. Do-hyun met her at the entrance. She nodded at him. She didn't recognize him. To her, he was just the logistics guy who'd called in a technician. He led her to the second compressor. The compressor was running normally. The night before, Do-hyun had loosened one valve so the pressure would drop slightly. Not enough to break the system, but enough to call in a technician. Ji-yu opened the panel. She looked inside. She felt the pipes. She checked the pressure. She found the loosened valve in 30 seconds. She looked at Do-hyun. She said that someone had tampered with the valve. Do-hyun said he didn't know. Maybe the night shift had touched it. Ji-yu looked at him again, for a moment longer. Then she shrugged. She tightened the valve. She checked the rest of the components. She worked silently and quickly. Her hands moved like a musician's, precise and without any unnecessary movements. The skin on her fingers was cracked from the soldering iron and solvents. Her nails were short, with no polish. Do-hyun stood nearby and watched. At one point, he asked how long she'd been doing this. Ji-yu didn't turn around. She said since she was 18. 10 years. He asked if she liked it. She replied that she did. Machines don't lie. They don't whine. They don't ask to borrow money. They do what they're built to do. People are more complicated. Do-hyun smiled. He said he agreed. Ji-yu closed the panel. She wiped her hands with a rag. She turned to face him. She asked why he'd called her here. The compressor was fine. The valve had been loosened on purpose. She wasn't stupid. Do-hyun was silent for 3 seconds. Then he told the truth. Partially. He said he needed an engineer, a good one, for a long-term project. An autonomous life support system for an underground facility. A generator, ventilation, heating, electrical wiring, water supply. Ji-yu folded her arms. She asked what kind of facility it was. He said it was a bomb shelter. She raised an eyebrow. She asked why he needed a bomb shelter. He said he was preparing for winter. Ji-yu was silent for about 5 seconds. Then she pulled a cigarette from behind her ear. She didn't light it. She just twirled it between her fingers. She said he wasn't the first eccentric to build a bunker, but he was the first to call a professional to propose it. Do-hyun said he'd pay. He'd pay well. Ji-yu said it wasn't about the money. She was curious. She'd wanted to build something from scratch for a long time. Not just fix up someone else's junk, but build something of her own. She said she'd come take a look over the weekend. If the space was any good, she'd consider it. Saturday, Do-hyun drove Ji-yu to the fortress. She walked down the steps, turned on her flashlight, walked through all the rooms, tapped on the walls, checked the ventilation, tugged on the well pump, opened the generator panel, and spent 20 minutes silently studying the wiring. Then she sat down on a crate in the middle of the main hall and lit a cigarette. It was her first time in front of him. She took a deep drag, exhaled. She said the place was good. The walls were thick, the ventilation worked. The well wasn't deep, but it was sufficient. The generator was old, but still running. The wiring he'd done was a nightmare, and she'd redo everything from scratch. But overall, yes, you could live here. For a long time, if it's set up properly. Do-hyun asked if she'd take the job. Ji-yu looked at him through the smoke. She asked what he was hiding from. He said he wasn't hiding. He was preparing. She asked for what? He said for the cold. She put out her cigarette. She stood up. She said she needed a list of all the rooms and their purposes. Floor area, temperature requirements, number of people, load on the electrical system, preferably in a table. Do-hyun pulled a folded sheet of paper out of his pocket. A table, 5 rooms, floor area, purpose, required temperature, number of outlets, equipment power, power load. Everything was listed. Ji-yu took the sheet. She read it. She looked at him. She said he didn't look like a logistics specialist. Do-hyun said that a good logistics specialist has to be ready for anything. Ji-yu folded the sheet and put it in the pocket of her overalls. She said she'd start next week, in the evenings and on weekends. Her main job remains for now. They went upstairs. Ji-yu lit her second cigarette and looked up at the sky. An October sky, blue, high. She said the sky had been acting strange lately, too bright during the day and too dark at night, as if the atmosphere were changing. Do-hyun looked up. She was right. The first signs. Those very anomalies that meteorologists will start talking about in a month. The polar vortex is breaking down. Gray domes over Siberia and Canada.
The temperature in the upper layers of the atmosphere is dropping in spurts, but so far, only those who look closely at the sky have noticed it. Engineers, farmers, people who work with their hands and eyes rather than sitting in front of a screen. Do-hyun said she was right. The sky was strange, and it would soon become even stranger. Ji-yu looked at him. She didn't ask what he meant. She just nodded, as if she knew. 5 out of 6. Only So-yeon remained. So-yeon Che turned out to be the hardest one. Not because she was hard to reach. Do-hyun found the address of her office online in 3 minutes. A child psychologist. Private practice. A small office in a residential building in the Gupo district. The problem lay elsewhere. So-yeon was his first love. Back in high school. A desk by the window. A girl in glasses, reading a book. He sat behind her for 3 years and never dared to say a word to her during those 3 years. She was the kind of girl who read during breaks, who answered questions at the blackboard calmly and precisely, who rarely smiled, but when she did, the world around her seemed to stand still for a second. Do-hyun was even quieter back then than he is now, even more inconspicuous. A boy whom teachers confused with another boy in the neighboring class. He graduated from school without saying goodbye to her. He just left. He thought he'd forgotten. In a past life, he met her by chance, the second month of winter. A line for bread in front of the only bakery in the neighborhood that was still open. 100 people in 40-degree cold. He stood there, unable to feel his feet, and suddenly he heard a voice. Do-hyun. So, Do-hyun, it's you. He turned around. So-yeon. Thinner, paler, in an old, ill-fitting down jacket. The same glasses, the same smile. They talked for 5 minutes. She told him she'd been working with the children until the very end, that her office had been ransacked in the 3rd week, that she'd moved in with friends, but they'd soon ask her to leave. She asked how he was doing. He said he was holding up. She nodded. She said she was glad to see him, that he'd always been the quietest boy in the class, but she remembered how he once gave his lunch to a boy from a parallel class who'd been robbed by the older kids. He didn't remember that. She did. The line started moving. They were separated. He bought some bread and went looking for her. He didn't find her. That evening, the store across the street from the bakery collapsed under the weight of snow on the roof. 32 people were inside. So-yeon was among them. He found out the next day. He sat down in the snow and stayed there until dark. He didn't cry. He just sat there. Now he was standing in front of the door to her office, and his palms were sweaty. There was a nameplate on the door. Cho So-yeon. Child Psychology. By appointment only. He hadn't made an appointment. He pressed the intercom button. Silence. Then a voice. Soft and calm. That very voice. She asked who it was. Do-hyun said his name. So Do-hyun. Chungang High School. Class of 11. Silence. 3 seconds. Then the lock clicked.
He walked in. A small hallway, a coat rack, children's drawings on the walls, the smell of green tea. The door to the office was ajar. Soyeon was sitting at her desk, 28 years old, thin-framed glasses, shoulder-length hair. On the table were books and colored pencils. Behind her was a shelf with stuffed animals for working with children. She looked at him. She recognized him. He saw images flash through her eyes. The classroom, desks, the quiet boy who had sat behind her for 3 years. She said she remembered him. She said she was surprised. She asked how he'd found her. Do-hyun told the truth. He'd found her online. He sat down on a visitor's chair, a small chair meant for children, his knees pressed against his chin. So-young smiled. She said the chair was for patients, but that an adult could sit on the couch. Do-hyun moved to the couch. So-yeon asked why he had come. Do-hyun remained silent. He couldn't tell her that in 2.5 months she would die under the rubble of the store.
He couldn't tell her that he remembered how she had stood in line wearing an old down jacket and smiled at him. He couldn't tell her that he had returned from the future and that she was on his list, between Emma and the wall. He said he just wanted to see a familiar face, that he was going through a rough patch and had been thinking about high school. He remembered the people who had been kind to him. She had been kind to him. So-yeon looked at him. She was a psychologist. She could read people like open books. She could tell he was telling the truth, but not the whole truth. She said she understood, that school ties sometimes turn out to be stronger than we think. She offered him tea. They drank green tea and talked. Not about winter, not about the past, about the present. She told him that she works with children from troubled families, that it's hard but important, that sometimes a child says just one sentence and everything inside you turns upside down. She told him about a boy who hadn't spoken for 4 months and, on the 5th month, drew a house without doors. She showed him the drawing. A house. Walls. Windows. A roof. But not a single door. The child couldn't go out and couldn't let anyone in. She worked with him for another 6 months. In the last drawing, a door appeared. A small one, right at the bottom, but it was there. Do-hyun listened and understood why he couldn't forget this woman. Not because she was beautiful. She was beautiful, but that wasn't why. Because she was the kind of person who sees doors that aren't there, and helps draw them. He sat with her for 2 hours. Toward the end, she asked if he would come back. He said yes. She said she'd be happy to, but she warned him that she was a psychologist, not a friend, and if he needed professional help, she wouldn't be able to handle both roles. Do-hyun said he didn't need a psychologist. He needed someone he trusted. So-yeon took off her glasses and wiped them with the hem of her sweater. It was a gesture he remembered from school. She always did that when she was thinking. She put her glasses back on and said that trust was a big word for a first meeting. Do-hyun said this wasn't their first meeting. They'd known each other for 17 years. They just hadn't spoken in a long time. So-yeon smiled. That very smile that made the world stand still for a second. Do-hyun left her office and got into the bongo. 6 out of 6. All the threads were taut. Now it was a matter of time. Time for the threads to become ropes, ropes to become cables, and the cables to become the walls of the fortress, behind which these 6 people would survive the end of the world. 60 days remained until day 0. November, 60 days until day 0. Do-hyun stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night. His days were scheduled down to the minute. Morning, coffee at Ari's, 10 minutes of conversation, a drawing on the glass. She had started drawing individual pictures for him on napkins, little sketches, a cat in a scarf, a girl with an umbrella, a house with smoke coming from the chimney. He took each one and put it in the warehouse. Ari didn't know that in 2 months, these napkins would become the first decorations on the concrete walls of the fortress. After coffee, a work shift at the warehouse, 8 hours, the scanner, pallets, a forklift, then lunch in the break room. Sometimes with Hannah. She'd bring her rice in a container, and they'd sit next to each other. She'd talk about her exams, about her term paper on closed-loop hydroponic systems, about the professor who thought she was the best in the class, but gave her B's because she was a girl and didn't need a summa cum laude degree. Do-hyun listened and memorized every term, every system, every germination temperature. After his shift, he'd drive to the fortress. GU worked there every evening. She'd reworked all the wiring in 2 weeks, run new cables, installed circuit breakers and a distribution panel, connected the generator to the main line. She installed the ventilation system with filters and valves. Do-hyun helped her. He held the wires. He handed her tools. He hauled heavy loads.
Ji-yu commanded him like a recruit, and he obeyed without question. She didn't say thank you. She didn't smile. She just worked. But one evening, when they were done and sitting in the main hall by the light of a kerosene lamp, she said that working with him was easy, not because he was smart, but because he didn't argue when he didn't understand, and didn't pretend to understand when he didn't argue. For Ji-yu, that was a compliment. Do-hyun knew it. At the same time, he continued shopping. Every weekend, wholesale markets, farmers markets, and hardware stores. He bought supplies for hydroponics, pipes, pumps, containers, grow lights, nutrient solutions, and seeds, tomatoes, cucumbers, Napa cabbage, greens, radishes, everything that could grow indoors under artificial light. Hana didn't know yet that these seeds were for her, that in 3 months she would be the chief agronomist of the underground community, and these seeds would mean the difference between life and starvation. Do-hyun also bought chickens, 5 laying hens and 1 rooster, alive. The warehouse doesn't accept live animals, but the fortress does. He brought the birds in cages and left them in the back room. Ji-yu looked at the chickens. She looked at him. She said he was definitely crazy. Then she asked what voltage the incubator lamp required. Money was running out. By mid-November, only 6 million won remained from the loan and savings. Do-hyun drew up a priority list of final purchases. Fuel, diesel for the generator. He found a farmer outside the city who sold diesel in bulk with delivery. He bought 1,000 liters. It was expensive. But 1,000 liters of diesel would keep the generator running for 4 months in economy mode. After doubling the stock at the warehouse, there would be 2,000 liters in 3 weeks, then 4,000. Clothing. He bought winter clothes for 20 people, not exactly to size, roughly. Jackets, pants, boots, hats, gloves, thermal underwear, wool socks. For each of his 6 people, he bought items separately and to exact specifications. For Minsu, warm medical gowns and comfortable shoes with thick soles. For Ari, a set of professional paints, paper, and brushes, enough to last 10 years. He found an art supply store in Seoul and spent 2 hours there making his selections. The saleswoman asked if he was an artist. Do-hyun said no, that he was buying for someone who paints better than she speaks. For Ji-yu, good hand cream and a soft gray-blue wool sweater. He estimated the size by eye. Ji-yu wore overalls every day, and he knew her figure down to the centimeter. Not because he was watching her, because a logistics specialist notices measurements. For Hana, a new copy of the hydroponics textbook to replace her worn-out one, and a full set of seeds for experiments. For Emma, peanut butter. 20 jars. She misses it more than she misses hot water. And a portable radio, that very one, through which she'll one day hear her mother's voice from Ohio. For Soyeon, a set of children's books and stuffed animals for her work, and a separate soft alpaca blanket, because even a psychologist needs someone to wrap her up. Every item in the warehouse had a mental label. For whom, why, when to give it. Do-hyun wasn't buying things, he was buying care, packed into boxes and arranged on shelves. Late November, 50 days until day 0. The news began to change. Small things at first. The Weather Service reported an unusual cold snap in the upper atmosphere over the North Pole. A university scientist gave an interview in which he said that the polar vortex was behaving unpredictably. Social media picked up on it and started joking. Memes about an ice age, funny pictures of penguins in Seoul. No one took it seriously. Do-hyun read the news and said nothing. He knew the timeline. In 3 weeks, gray domes would appear, areas over Siberia and Canada where sunlight would no longer penetrate. Governments would begin holding closed-door meetings. In 5 weeks, temperatures around the world would start dropping by 1 or 2 degrees a day. People would start getting nervous, but wouldn't panic yet. Supermarkets would stay open. The heat would still be on. Everything will still seem normal. And then, overnight, -40 in Seoul. And that's it. He sat alone in the fortress. Ji-yu had gone home. The generator hummed steadily. The lights were on. Chickens clucked in the back room. More than 10 metric tons of food lay in the warehouse. Thousands of units of medicine. Hundreds of items of clothing, tools, fuel, seeds, books. 25 kilograms of strawberries, as fresh as yesterday. Do-hyun opened the mental spreadsheet and scrolled through it. 1,200 rows. Each row represents someone's life. A sack of rice means a week of life for 20 people. A box of antibiotics means a child with pneumonia saved. A jar of peanut butter means Emma's smile. He closed the spreadsheet. He stood up. He walked through the fortress, the main hall, 2 living quarters, the infirmary, the kitchen, the storage room, the workshop. He stopped in the workshop. Ji-yu had hung a handwritten sign on the wall. Workshop, do not touch the wires. Punishment by teeth. Du-hyun smiled. Then he looked at the empty wall opposite. He took a marker from the storage room and wrote, Ari's paintings will be here. He looked at it. He erased it. Too soon. 50 more days. He went upstairs. He stepped outside. A November night. Cold, but normally cold. +5. In 50 days, it'll be -40, and that'll be a warm day. Du-hyun got into the bongo and drove home. On the way, he stopped by the building's entrance. He looked up. Emma's window was lit. She wasn't asleep. Maybe she was baking cookies.
Maybe she was calling her mom. Maybe she was just sitting alone, staring at the wall, thinking about her home across the ocean. He stood there for a minute. Then he went up to his apartment. December. 40 days until day 0. The world began to take notice. Gray domes appeared over Siberia. Satellite images leaked online. Vast areas where the clouds hung motionless like a concrete roof. No sunlight penetrated them. The temperature beneath the domes dropped to -70. Meteorologists offered cautious comments. They said it was a temporary anomaly linked to a disturbance in the polar vortex, that everything would return to normal in a few weeks. Governments held closed-door meetings and remained silent. Social media stopped joking around. Memes gave way to alarming posts. People began asking what was happening, but they weren't panicking yet. Supermarkets were open. The heat was on. Gas prices were the same as usual. Life still seemed normal. Do-hyun read the news and counted down the days. He knew things would happen faster than people thought. In 3 weeks, the temperature in Seoul would start dropping by 2 degrees a day. In 4 weeks, panic would set in. In 5 weeks, store shelves would be empty. In 6 weeks, power grids would start going down. And then, one night. One night, and the world they knew would cease to exist. He needed to speed things up. Du-hyun quit his job. He went to see Kim and said he was leaving due to family circumstances. His mother was sick. He needed to take care of her. Kim looked at him sympathetically. He shook his hand. He said that if he ever decided to come back, his job would be waiting for him. Du-hyun thanked him. He picked up his employment record book and walked out. He didn't look back. Mr. Kim was a good man. A kind, weary man who had forgiven him 12 pallets worth of overdue payments with a single wave of his hand. In his past life, Kim had died during the 2nd week of winter. A heart attack. The ambulance didn't come because there were no more ambulances. Du-hyun couldn't save everyone. He could save 20, and Kim wasn't among those 20. That decision cost him 2 sleepless nights, but he made it and moved on. Now he could work at the fortress full-time, and the first thing he did was bring Hana and Ji-yu together. He drove them to the fortress one evening. Hana had never been in a bomb shelter before. She walked down the steps and stopped. The main hall was already set up. A generator hummed behind the wall. The lamps gave off a steady, warm light. Ji-yu had hung wiring diagrams on the walls. In the corner stood a workbench with tools. In the back room, chickens clucked. Hana walked around the whole place, silently. She stopped in the 3rd room. It was empty. It had good lighting and water from a well tap. Do-hyun said this room was for her, for hydroponics. Hana turned to face him. Her face was pale. Her eyes were wide. She asked what it was. Why? Do-hyun said he needed a place where he could grow food, underground, without soil, under artificial light, all year round. Hana looked at him for 5 seconds. Then she looked at the room, at the pipes along the wall, at the lamps on the ceiling, at the faucet with clean water. She said it was possible, with the right system, with the right seeds, with the right lighting. But why? Do-hyun said that winter would be coming soon. Hana said that winter comes every year. Do-hyun said this one would be different. Hana looked at him. She remembered what she'd told him in her past life. Mister, so they'll eat you alive for this. Literally. Of course, she didn't actually remember that. It was in another life. But she was one of those people who senses the truth before it's spoken. She didn't ask anything else. She said she needed a list of seeds and the daily water intake. Du-hyun pulled a folded sheet of paper out of his pocket. Seeds, water intake, lighting schedule, temperature. Everything was listed. Hana took the sheet. She read it. She looked at him. She said he definitely wasn't a logistics specialist. Ji-yu was standing in the doorway, smoking. She said she told him the same thing. They laughed. All 3 of them. Together for the first time. Warm laughter in a cold, concrete room underground. That evening, Du-hyun brought the first shipment of hydroponic supplies to the fortress. Pipes, pumps,
containers, lamps, nutrient solutions, seeds. Hannah laid everything out on the floor and muttered to herself about the solution's pH level and the light spectrum. Ji-yu plugged the lamps into the outlet and cursed the cheap connectors. Do-hyun hauled boxes and smiled silently. 3 people, an engineer, an agronomist, a logistics specialist. The first core of the community. A week had passed. 33 days until day 0. The temperature in Seoul had dropped 4 degrees below normal. The Weather Service issued a warning about an unusually cold winter. Supermarkets began to see a rise in sales of canned goods and grains. It was insignificant, 2 or 3%. People were buying just a little more than usual, just in case. But they weren't panicking. Do-hyun began rounding up the others. Minso, he called her. They'd seen each other 3 times over the past month. He'd give her a ride home after her shift. They'd talk. She'd tell him about work. He'd listen. She'd grown accustomed to him, not as a friend, but as someone who showed up when needed and asked for nothing in return. He called and asked if she could come take a look at a space. He needed advice on setting up a first aid station. Minsu asked what kind of first aid station. He said he'd explain when she got there. She paused. Then she said okay. He drove her to the fortress. She went downstairs. She looked around. She walked into the room he designated as the first aid station. It was empty for now. But a sign was already hanging on the door. Medical station. Minso Lee. She saw the sign and stopped. She turned to face him. He was standing in the hallway, silent. She asked what it meant. He said this was her place, if she wanted it. He said he was gathering people, those he trusted, those who knew how to help. He's building a place where they can survive what's coming. Minsu asked what was coming. Do-hyun said it would be cold, very cold, and it would last a long time. Minsu looked at him. Her eyes were tired. Her back was straight. She wasn't afraid. She was never afraid. She was becoming calmer. She said she needed equipment. A treatment table, a sterilizer, instruments, medications. He said she'd have everything. She nodded. She didn't smile. She didn't say thank you. She just nodded and began pacing the room, figuring out where to put the examination table, where the medicine cabinet would go, and where the sink would be. Do-hyun stood in the doorway and watched her. He looked at the nameplate with her name on it. 3 years ago, in another life, she'd given him her lunch and taken nothing in return. A rice ball wrapped in a napkin. He remembered the taste. Now she'd have her own infirmary, with her name on the door, with her favorite tea on the shelf, with a chair in the corner where she could sleep after her shift. It wasn't a gift. It was a debt that couldn't be explained. Emma. It was different with her. He couldn't bring her to the fortress until day 0. He couldn't show her the bomb shelter and tell her that the world would end. Emma wouldn't believe it. Emma is a bright, open-minded person who thinks that bad things happen to other people. She'll only believe it when she sees it. That's why Do-hyun had prepared a different plan for her. On day 0, when the temperature drops, he'll be the first to arrive at her door, before the panic sets in, before the neighbors remember that she's a foreigner. He'll take her and everything she can carry and drive her to the fortress. He had a route, planned down to the minute. Emma's apartment, 7 minutes to pack. The car, 20 minutes to the fortress on winter roads, if the roads are still passable. If not, 40 minutes on foot through the industrial zone. He'd calculated both options. So Young was the hardest part. She lived farther away. The Gupo district, 30 minutes by car under normal conditions. On the day of the disaster, it might take an hour, or 2, or it might be impossible. Do-hyun visited her every week. They drank tea. They talked. She told him about her children. He listened. Once she asked why he came. He said he felt comfortable with her. She took off her glasses and wiped them. Then she put them back on. She said he could feel comfortable with anyone. He chose her, and she wanted to understand why. Do-hyun was silent for a long time. Then he said that in school she was the only person he wanted to ask out, but he didn't have the courage, and he'd regretted it his whole life. So-yeon looked at him. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't embarrassed. She just looked at him. Then she said quietly that she remembered, that she'd noticed, that she'd been waiting, and that she'd regretted it too. They sat in silence for a minute. Then Do-hyun said he wanted her to come to him if she got scared, no matter what happened, no matter when it happened. Just call him, and he'd come. So-yeon said okay. 25 days until day 0. The fortress was almost ready. 2 living quarters with beds and heaters, a medical station with equipment, a kitchen with a stove and a supply of dishes, Ji-Yu's workshop, Hana's hydroponics setup, A storage room with physical supplies that Do-hyun had been moving over from the warehouse in batches. A generator, ventilation, water, light, heat. Do-hyun stood in the middle of the main hall, looking at everything he had built over the past 2 months. 20 people could live here. For a long time. A year, 2, 5, 7.
If they had enough discipline, and if those who wanted to take it away didn't come. He thought of Han Soo-jang, the Winter Baron, a former debt collector. In his past life, Hansu had appeared in the 3rd month. He'd taken control of Incheon Port. He'd assembled a gang of former debt collectors and security guards. He controlled the warehouses near the port. He collected tribute from anyone who wanted to eat. Do-hyun knew that Hansu was already preparing. He was already buying up weapons. He's rounding up people. He's scouting out warehouses. Hansu didn't know about winter from the future. He was simply the kind of person who was always preparing for the worst, or so Do-hyun thought. He didn't yet know that Hansu was also a regressor, that Hansu had also died and come back, that Hansu also remembered. That revelation would come later, and it would turn everything upside down. 25 days. Do-hyun locked the fortress with a new lock. He went upstairs. He looked up at the sky. Gray. Low. The temperature was 2 degrees above zero. For December in Incheon, that's normal. Normal for now. He got in his car and drove home. On the way, he stopped at a store and bought some peanut butter, the last jar on the shelf. He put it in the storage room. For Emma. The 21st jar. 20 days until day 0. The temperature in Seoul had dropped 8 degrees below the seasonal average. -12 in December. Cold, but not unbearable. People bundled up in jackets and complained about the utility companies. Every evening, the news showed satellite images of gray domes. They were expanding. Siberia, Canada, Scandinavia, now Alaska. Scientists debated on the air. Some said it was a temporary phenomenon. Others remained silent, and that silence spoke louder than any words. The South Korean government held a closed-door meeting, after which the president delivered a brief address. He said the situation was under control, that energy reserves were sufficient, that citizens were advised to remain calm and follow the instructions of local authorities. Do-hyun watched this address on his phone screen while sitting in the fortress. He knew every word in advance. In his past life, he had watched this same address in his apartment and believed it. He stayed calm. He followed the instructions. And 3 weeks later, he was left without electricity, without heat, and without food. This time, he turned off his phone and went to check the generator. The panic began 10 days later, 10 days before day 0. The temperature was -20 in December in Seoul. Nothing like this had ever happened before. People woke up in the morning and saw that the water in the pipes had frozen. Not everywhere. So far, only in old buildings with poor insulation. But that was enough. The supermarkets were flooded with shoppers in a single day. The shelves of canned goods were empty by lunchtime. The rice was sold out by evening. Salt and sugar had vanished by nightfall. A quiet stampede began. Not the kind with screams and smashed storefronts. A quiet one. The kind where people silently jostle each other with their shopping carts and eye other people's bags with hungry eyes. Do-hyun watched through the window of his car, parked at the hypermarket next to his former workplace. He didn't go inside. He didn't need to buy anything. His warehouse held enough food to feed 30 people for 3 years. He watched the people coming out of the store with their bags stuffed full. He watched their faces, hasty, angry, frightened. In 10 days, those bags would be empty. In 20 days, these people would be killing each other over a can of stew. He knew it. He'd seen it. And he couldn't save them all. Do-hyun started the car and drove to Ari's. The coffee shop was still open. Ari was standing behind the counter, but there were no customers. Empty. Cold. The heating was barely keeping up. Ari saw him and smiled, but it was a different kind of smile. An anxious one. She said the cafe owner was talking about closing down, that suppliers had tripled their prices, that they hadn't delivered milk for 2 days. Do-hyun sat down at a table. Ari brought him an Americano. Her hands were trembling. Not from the cold, from nerves. She sat down across from him and said she was scared, that she'd been watching the news and didn't understand what was happening, that she'd called her mom in Daegu, and her mom said it was cold there too. Very cold. This doesn't happen in Korea. Do-hyun looked at her. Purple hair, an apron with cats drawn on it. A small notebook was sticking out of her pocket. He said he wanted her to listen to him carefully, that what he was about to say would sound crazy, but he asked her to believe him. Ari looked at him. She didn't interrupt. He said that in 10 days, the temperature would drop to -40 overnight, that the electricity would go out, that the heat would stop working, that the stores would close forever, that the world she knew would cease to exist, and that he had a place, a warm, safe place, with food, water, and light.
and he wanted her to be there. Ari was silent. She looked at him. Her eyes were shining. She said he was crazy. Then she said the drawing. That drawing. A city in the snow. She'd been dreaming about it again. Every night. The same dream. She'd been drawing it on glasses for a week now and erasing it before anyone could see it. She said she believed him. Not because he'd convinced her, because she already knew. Somewhere deep inside. She knew and was afraid to admit it. Do-hyun reached across the table and clasped her hand. He said he'd take her away. When it began. She nodded. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She just nodded and held his hand. For the next 10 days, Do-hyun worked according to the plan. Every day, a call to each of the 6, a check-in, coordination, instructions. He told Hain to pack warm clothes and her documents. She didn't ask why. She was already working at the fortress every evening. The hydroponic system was set up. The first seeds were planted. The first sprouts were pushing their way up under the lamps. He didn't say anything to Ji-yu. She already knew. She moved her personal set of tools and her sleeping bag to the fortress, silently, without explanation. He called Min-so and told her she needed to put together an emergency first aid kit, everything she could take from the clinic, officially or unofficially. Min-soo was silent for 3 seconds.
Then she said the clinic would be closing in a week anyway. Half the staff wasn't coming to work anymore. She'd take everything she could carry. He brought Emma a backpack, a large hiking backpack. He set it by her door. He rang the doorbell. She opened the door. He told her that if it got very cold one night, she should pack everything essential into that backpack. Documents, warm clothes, photographs, and wait for him to knock on the door. Emma looked at him. Then she looked at the backpack, then back at him. She said he was scaring her. He said he wanted her to be safe. Emma took the backpack. She said, "Okay," and quietly closed the door. Soyeon. He drove to see her in Gupo. He sat down on her couch. She brought him tea. He said that in a few days the world would change, that she needed to pack her things, that he would come for her. Soyeon took off her glasses. She wiped them. She put them back on. She said she was a psychologist and could recognize panic disorder when she saw it. But he didn't have panic disorder. His eyes were calm, and his hands were trembling. It wasn't panic. It was knowledge. She asked how he knew what he knew. Do-hyun was silent. Then he said he couldn't explain it. Not yet, anyway. But he asked her to believe him. Soyeon looked at him for a long time. Then she said she would believe him, not because he'd convinced her, but because that boy from school who gave his lunch to a stranger's child would never lie. 5 days until day 0. The temperature was -28. Schools were closed. Some offices switched to remote work. Gas-fired heating plants were running at full capacity. The power grid was faltering. 3 districts of Seoul experienced a 6-hour rolling blackout. People were burning gas stoves to keep warm. 2 people suffocated from carbon monoxide poisoning. The news reported it between commercials for winter jackets and the weather forecast. Do-hyun made his final run. He loaded warm blankets into the bongo, canisters of diesel, the last boxes from the warehouse. He brought them to the fortress, unloaded them, unpacked them. He checked the generator. He checked the ventilation. He checked the water. He checked the supplies. Everything was in place. Everything was ready. He stood in the main hall and counted the beds. 19. The number of people he expected to take in. 6 girls. Himself. And 12 spots for those they'd pick up along the way. Children. The elderly. Those with no one to take them in. He didn't know who they would be, but he knew there had to be room, because an empty bed isn't a waste. It's a promise. Do-hyun turned off the light. He went upstairs. He looked up at the sky. Gray. Heavy. Oppressive. The air smelled of iron. That's how frost smells when it really sets in. Do-hyun got into his car. He drove home. He lay down on his sagging bed for the last time. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow, or the day after, or in 3 days, the world would freeze over, and the real work would begin. Day 0 arrived on Thursday, at 3 in the morning. Do-hyun wasn't sleeping. He was sitting on his bed, wearing a winter jacket, with his backpack on the floor, waiting. He knew it would happen at night. In his past life, he'd woken up to the sound of shattering glass. The kitchen window hadn't withstood the temperature drop, -40 in 2 hours. Now he was watching the thermometer outside the window, -29, -30, -32. The temperature was dropping before his eyes, -35.
The windows began to frost over from the inside. The radiators were still warm, but barely.
-38. Do-hyun got up. It was time. He stepped out into the hallway and knocked on Emma's door. 3 knocks. A pause. 2 knocks. The code he'd given her a week ago. Silence. Then footsteps. The door opened. Emma stood there in her jacket, a backpack slung over her shoulders. Her eyes were red. She hadn't slept either. She said the thermometer read -40, that the heat had gone out 10 minutes ago, that she could hear the windows cracking in the stairwell. Do-hyun took her by the hand and said, "Let's go." They went down the stairs. The elevator wasn't working. The lights were flickering and going out. A light was on the 3rd floor. Someone was screaming. It smelled like gas on the 2nd floor. Someone had turned on a burner. They went out onto the street. It was -42. The air burned their lungs. Emma gasped for air and doubled over. Do-hyun took a scarf from the storage room and wrapped it around her face. Quickly, in one motion. Emma didn't see where he'd gotten the scarf. It was dark. There was no time for questions. The bongo stood in the courtyard, covered in frost. Do-hyun opened the door. The engine started on the 3rd try. He'd already filled it with winter oil and antifreeze rated for -60. They drove out of the courtyard. The streets were empty. Streetlights flickered and went out one after another. The traffic lights weren't working. The first snow fell in thick, heavy flakes. Not ordinary snow. Heavy. Wet. It settled on the road at a rate of 1 centimeter per minute. Do-hyun drove slowly and confidently. He knew the route. First stop, Ari's apartment. 10 minutes. He went up to the 4th floor. Ari was sitting in the hallway by her door, wearing a jacket, with a backpack, and a small notebook pressed to her chest. She saw him and stood up. She didn't say a word. She just stood up and followed him. In the car, she sat next to Emma in the back seat. Emma hugged her. They didn't know each other, but that night, it didn't matter. Second stop, Hana's house. The suburbs, 20 minutes down a snow-covered road. Hana was standing by the entrance, alone. A small figure in a dark jacket, a backpack, and a second backpack. Do-hyun got out of the car. He walked over. Hana lifted the second backpack and said they were seeds, from the university lab. She'd taken everything she could carry, 30 varieties. Do-hyun took the backpack. It was heavy. He put it in the trunk. Hana didn't see where he put it. It was dark. They drove on. Third stop, the clinic. Min-so was waiting inside. She came out with 2 large bags, medications, instruments, dressing supplies, everything she could carry out. She said the clinic was empty. Everyone had fled the previous evening. She'd locked the doors all by herself. She got into the car. She looked at the 3 girls in the back seat, then at Do-hyun. She said he knew. Do-hyun nodded. She didn't ask anything else. Fourth stop, the fortress. Do-hyun dropped the 4 of them off at the entrance. He gave Min-so the keys. "Go downstairs," he said. "The generator is turned on by the switch to the right of the door. It's the red button." They went downstairs. Do-hyun turned the bongo around and drove back to the city, to GU. She lived in a different neighborhood, a 25-minute drive. The road was worse. The snow was already ankle deep. The temperature was -46. The bongo skidded on the turns. Do-hyun arrived. He went up to the 6th floor. GU opened the door before he even knocked. She was standing there in overalls, with a tool bag, a cigarette tucked behind her ear. She said she'd been waiting for him, that she'd seen the forecast and understood. She said he'd known from the very beginning, from the day he called her to fix a compressor that was working fine. Do-hyun said yes. She nodded. They went down to the car. GU got into the front seat and looked at the thermometer on the dashboard. -48. She whistled. She said the generator would hold up, but they'd have to keep an eye on the fuel. They drove off. 5th stop, the farthest, the most important, Gupo, Soyeon. 30 minutes before day 0, it had been a 30-minute drive. Now the trip took an hour. Snow, black ice, abandoned cars on the shoulders, people who had run out of their houses and didn't know where to go, silhouettes in the darkness. Do-hyun drove around them. Each time his hands clenched the steering wheel. Each time he told himself, "No, not now. My people first, then the rest." They reached Gupo. The neighborhood was dark, a total blackout, not a single street light. Not a single lit window. Do-hyun pulled up in front of Soyeon's house. He went up to the 3rd floor. He knocked. Silence. He knocked again. Silence. His heart began to pound. He pounded on the door with his fist.
So-yeon! It's Do-hyun! Open up! The lock clicked. The door opened. So-yeon stood in the darkness, in a coat, with a scarf, carrying a backpack. She was ready. But she wasn't alone. Behind her stood 2 children, a boy of about 6, a girl of about 5, wrapped in blankets. So-yeon said they were her neighbor's children. Their parents had gone to the store 2 hours ago and hadn't returned. She couldn't leave them behind. Do-hyun looked at the children. The boy stared at him with wide eyes. The girl clung to So-yeon's leg. He nodded. He picked up the boy. "Let's go," he said. They went down to the car. Ji-yu saw the children and said nothing. She just moved aside. They drove back. On the way, Do-hyun noticed a small figure by the entrance to his old house. A pink jacket, a bear-shaped backpack. Mina, the girl from the swings, 7 years old, all alone, out in the cold, at -50. Do-hyun stopped the car. He jumped out. He ran over. Mina was sitting on the steps and wasn't crying. She was freezing. Her lips were blue. Her hands had no gloves. Do-hyun grabbed her. He held her close. He took a warm blanket from the storage room and wrapped her in it, carried her to the car. Mina looked at him and said, "Uncle Do-hyun, I'm cold." He said he knew, that it would be warm soon. The car drove off. 20 minutes to the fortress, the longest 20 minutes. Snow was falling in sheets. Visibility was 3 meters. The temperature was -52. The bongo creaked and groaned. The engine coughed. But it kept going. They made it. They got out. The circuit breaker, the red button. The generator hummed to life. The lights flashed on. Warm yellow light flooded the concrete walls. Min-soo had already laid out the medical supplies. Hana turned on the lights above the hydroponics. Ari sat in the corner, clutching her notebook to her chest. Emma cried quietly, burying her face in her knees. Do-hyun set Mina down on the floor. He took off her wet jacket. He fetched some dry children's clothes from the storeroom. He changed her clothes. He wrapped her in a blanket. He sat her down by the heater. Min-soo came over and checked her pulse. She said it was mild hypothermia. She'd warm up in an hour. Do-hyun scanned the room. 7 women, 3 children, himself. 11 people, 19 beds, 8 were empty. The wind howled outside. It was -55, and the temperature was dropping. The world was falling apart. But down here, the lights were on, the generator was humming, and it smelled of kerosene and warmth. Do-hyun sat down on the floor by the wall. He closed his eyes. He took a breath. This time, he wouldn't die alone. The first month of winter, the fortress was alive. Up above, the world was dying, but down below, Do-hyun was establishing order. Every morning began the same way. Generator? Check. Ventilation? Check. Water? Check. The temperature inside? +18. Outside? -55. A 73-degree difference between life and death. That difference was maintained by 2-meter-thick concrete walls, and the generator that Ji-yu tended to as if it were her own child. For the first week, everyone was silent. Shock. Even those who knew what was coming couldn't have imagined it would be like this. Emma didn't leave her corner for 2 days. She sat wrapped in a blanket, staring at the wall. On the 3rd day, Do-hyun brought her a cup of hot tea and a jar of peanut butter. She looked at the jar, then at him. Then she started crying. She hugged the jar with both hands and cried for 10 minutes. Do-hyun sat beside her. He said nothing. When she calmed down, he told her he had 20 more jars, and that he'd get her more if she needed them. Emma laughed through her tears. She asked how. He said he'd explain later. Right now, something else was more important. She needed to get up and start living. She got up. In the 2nd week, Do-hyun called the first council meeting. Everyone gathered in the main hall. 11 people, 6 women, 3 children, himself, and Grandpa Park, the old man from the neighboring house whom Min-soo had brought on the 4th day. She'd found him in the stairwell. He was sitting on the steps, waiting to die. Min-soo hadn't asked for permission. She brought him over and said he was staying. Do-hyun looked at the old man, then at Min-soo. He nodded. 12 people, 18 beds. At the council meeting, Do-hyun said that everyone would be assigned a role. Min-soo, doctor, her medical station, her responsibility. All health-related matters go through her. Hana, agronomist, hydroponics, food they'll grow themselves. Ji-yu, engineer, generator, electricity, water, ventilation, everything that works and spins. Ari. He looked at her and said her role was special. He led her to a wall in the main hall, a large, empty concrete wall, and told her it was her wall. Paint. When it's all over, he wants them to have paintings, not just supplies. Ari looked at the wall, then at him, then at the paints he pulled from behind his back. A complete professional set. Brushes, paper, pencils, watercolors, oil paints, a 10-year supply. She took the box and pressed it to her chest. She didn't cry. She just stood there, holding it. Emma, teacher, for the children. Mina, the two neighborhood kids, Soyeon. They need lessons. They need a routine. They need normalcy in the midst of the end of the world. Soyeon, psychologist, for everyone, but especially for the children. Do-hyun turned to her and said something else. He said that the children she'd brought, and Mina, were now hers. Not a nanny, a mom, officially. He wrote it down in the community log. Che Soyeon, guardian, 3 children. Soyeon took off her glasses, wiped them, put them back on. Her hands were shaking. She didn't say anything. She just nodded. Grandpa Park, cook. The old man turned out to be a cook. 40 years in a restaurant, retired. He said his hands still remembered, and if they gave him ingredients, he'd feed everyone so well they'd forget they were living underground. Do-hyun gave him the ingredients, and Grandpa Park cooked the first soup in the fortress. Rice soup with chicken and vegetables. The real thing. Hot, steaming, with a scent that brought tears to their eyes.
They ate in silence. 12 people at one table. The children ate greedily. Emma ate slowly and closed her eyes. Ji-yu ate quickly and didn't look up. Min-so ate with one hand because she was holding Grandpa Park's hand with the other. He was crying quietly. Soyeon wasn't eating. She watched the children eat. A little girl, 5 years old. The one Soyeon had brought from Gupo. She lifted her head from her plate, looked at Soyeon, and said, "Mama Soyeon, can I have some more?" Soyeon turned away toward the wall. She remained silent for 10 minutes. Do-hyun stood in the doorway and was silent too. The third week. More people came to them. A woman with an infant. She was standing at the entrance to the fortress. It was unclear how she'd found it. Maybe she'd seen smoke coming from the ventilation shaft. Maybe she'd heard the hum of the generator. She was standing knee-deep in the snow, holding a bundle. Min-soo saw her on the camera that Ji-yu had set up at the entrance. She ran upstairs. She opened the door. She pulled the woman inside. The baby was 3 weeks old, blue from the cold. Min-soo worked on the baby for an hour. Do-hyun stood nearby and fetched everything she asked for from the storeroom. Blankets, hot water bottles, baby food. She didn't ask where he was getting it from. It wasn't the time for that. The baby survived. 14 people. The next day, an old man came with his grandson, then a couple without children, then a lone man with a bandaged arm. Each time, Do-hyun stood at the door and made the decision, who to let in, who not to. He didn't let the lone man in. Something in his eyes. Something in the way he looked past Do-hyun into the fortress, sizing it up. Do-hyun said there was no room. The man left. Min-so approached Do-hyun afterward and asked why. Do-hyun said that not everyone who is freezing is looking for warmth. Some are looking for someone else's warmth to take for themselves. Min-soo looked at him. She said he'd changed. He said he hadn't changed. He just remembers. The first month is over. 17 people in the fortress. There's enough food. The hydroponic system is yielding its first greens. The chickens are laying eggs. The generator is running. The children are learning English with Emma and drawing with Ari. Soyeon reads books to them every evening. Min-soo treats frostbite and colds. Ji-yu curses at the generator and fixes everything that breaks. Grandpa Park cooks soup and tells stories. And outside, it's -60. And someone is already searching for the fortress. The 4th month of winter. Hansu Jang found the fortress. Do-hyun knew this would happen. He didn't know when, but he knew that one day he'd see faces on the camera at the entrance. Faces that weren't asking. Faces that had come to take them away. Morning. Ji-yu woke him up at 5, quietly. She touched his shoulder. She said there were people on the monitor. 7 of them, armed, standing at the entrance without knocking. Just standing there, staring at the door. Do-hyun got up. He got dressed. He walked over to the monitor. 7 men in dark clothes. One in front. Tall, stocky. His face was covered by a scarf, but Do-hyun recognized him by his gait, by the way he stood. Feet slightly wider than shoulder width apart. Hands in his pockets. Head tilted slightly to the right. Hansu Jang, the Winter Baron. A former debt collector, the master of Incheon Port. They had never met in their past lives. Hansu appeared after Do-hyun's death. He rose to power while Do-hyun was already lying in the basement. In this life, they stood on opposite sides of a steel door at 4 in the morning, with the temperature at -60. Do-hyun turned on the external speaker.
He asked who he was and what he wanted. Hansu pulled the scarf off his face. He looked straight into the camera. He smiled. He said he knew there was food inside, that he'd been told, that he'd come to talk. Not to fight, to talk. Do-hyun stared at the screen. 7 of them, armed. But Hansu said he wanted to talk. In their past life, the debt collectors always started with a conversation. Then they'd break their fingers. Do-hyun said he'd go out alone. Ji-yu grabbed his sleeve. She told him he was an idiot. Do-hyun said they had no choice. If they didn't open the door, Hansu would come back with 20 men. If they opened it, there was a chance to negotiate. Ji-yu said that negotiating with gangsters wasn't a chance, it was suicide. Do-hyun said he had something Hansu wanted more than food, information. Hansu couldn't understand where a quiet logistics guy got his resources, and that confusion drove him crazier than any hunger. Do-hyun climbed the steps. He opened the door. He stepped outside. It was -60. The wind hit his face like a fist. Hansu stood 3 meters away. His men formed a semicircle behind him. Do-hyun held a thermos in his hands. Hot coffee. He grabbed it from the warehouse a second before stepping outside. Hansu looked at the thermos, then at Do-hyun. Do-hyun said he wanted to talk. He suggested they step aside. Just the 2 of them. Hansu looked at him for 10 seconds. Then he nodded to his men. They stayed where they were. Hansu and Do-hyun walked over to the wall of the ruined chemical plant building. Do-hyun opened the thermos. He poured coffee into the lid. He handed it to Hansu. Hansu took it. He took a sip. Hot coffee in the freezing cold at -60. He closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, there was something resembling surprise in his eyes. He asked where the coffee came from. Real coffee. Hot. Just like from a coffee shop. Do-hyun said he'd bought it in October. Hansu asked how it could still be hot if it was from October. Do-hyun didn't answer. Hansu set the lid down on a ledge in the wall. He looked at Do-hyun, straight on, without a smile, and said he knew who he was. Do-hyun, the logistics guy, apartment 704, the 9-story building by the park. In his first life, he died in the basement in the 3rd month. Do-hyun froze. The world stopped for a second. Hansu continued. He said he himself had died in the 4th week, a bullet to the chest, a rival fighting for territory. It was unfair. It was stupid. He was better. He just didn't make it in time. And then he woke up. July. The heat. The phone rings. A debt to be collected. Back to square one. Do-hyun looked at him. 2 regressors. 2 men who had returned from the same winter, with the same memory of death, with different conclusions. Hansu said he'd been watching Do-hyun since September, that he'd seen him buying up food by the ton, renting a basement, transporting people. He didn't understand how, where the money came from, where did the scale come from. He tried to do the same thing, but he didn't have Do-hyun's resources. All he had was his memory, perfect, minute by minute. He knew who was storing what, where, and when they would die. And he used that knowledge as best he could. He took it first. Do-hyun asked why he'd come. Hansu said he wanted to understand. How does a quiet logistics guy, with no connections, no weapons, and no gang, feed 20 people for 4 months without losing weight? Do-hyun said he'd bought the food honestly. Hansu laughed. He said that was impossible. He'd done the math. The volume needed to feed 20 people for 4 months amounts to tens of metric tons. One person couldn't buy that much in 3 months on a logistics specialist's salary. Do-hyun remained silent. Hansu stopped laughing. He looked him in the eyes. He said that Do-hyun had something. A gift, an ability, like his memory. Only different. Do-hyun said yes, he did. Hansu asked what exactly. Do-hyun said he wouldn't tell him. Hansu clenched his jaw. Then he relaxed it. He said he could take the shaft by force. He had 40 men, weapons. Do-hyun said he could, but then the food would run out in 3 months. And with Do-hyun, it would never run out. Hansu was silent for a long time. The wind howled. Snow stung their faces. Do-hyun stood and waited. Hansu said that Do-hyun was an idiot, that he would die again. Do-hyun said that was possible, but this time, he wouldn't be alone. Hansu looked at him. Then he said quietly that in his first life, he had a daughter, 3 years old. She died in her 2nd week, pneumonia. There was no medicine. He held her in his arms and watched as she stopped breathing. Then he stood up, went outside, and became who he became. Do-hyun was silent. Hansu said he'd come back for her sake, but when he woke up in July, his daughter wasn't there yet. She would be born in August of the following year, a year that wouldn't happen, because winter would come early. He'd come back to save a child who no longer existed. Silence. Only the wind. Do-hyun said he was sorry. Hansu lifted the lid off the thermos, finished his coffee, put it back down. Said he wouldn't storm the fortress. Today. But he'd be back. And Do-hyun had to be ready for the day when he wouldn't be able to say no. Hansu turned and walked back to his men. Do-hyun stood by the wall and watched as 7 figures faded into the snowy haze. Then he went down to the fortress. He sat down at the table. Everyone was looking at him. He said they had time. A little. Hansu would return, but not tomorrow. Ji-yu asked how much time they had. Do-hyun said he didn't know, but when Hansu returned, they would be ready. For the next 2 months, Do-hyun fortified the fortress. Ji-yu installed a second camera and an alarm system. The steel door was reinforced from the inside with beams. The emergency exit was better camouflaged. Do-hyun found people to provide security. 2 men from a neighboring warm spot with which he had established a barter arrangement. Former soldiers. He paid them with food. They stood guard for 12-hour shifts. The barter routes were up and running. Do-hyun traded double rations from the warehouse. Rice for medical knowledge, canned goods for engineering skills, and salt for information. 3 safe havens within a 10-kilometer radius. Each knew the fortress as a place where there was always food. No one knew where it came from. Do-hyun was becoming a legend, the master of the fortress, the quiet man whose rice never ran out. Hansu returned 2 months later, the 6th month of winter, this time with 20 people, at dawn. Do-hyun spotted them on the camera an hour earlier. He managed to rouse everyone. Ji-yu took up a position by the distribution panel. Min-so prepared the first aid station. The guards stood by the door. Hana led the children to the back room. So-yeon was with them. Ari stood by her wall with a paintbrush in her hand, not moving. Do-hyun walked up to the door. He turned on the loudspeaker. He told Hansu that he was running low on ammunition. Hansu didn't answer. His men began pounding on the door. Do-hyun waited. He counted the blows. He counted the time. He counted the rounds. He knew how many rounds Hansu had in October when he was buying up weapons. He knew how much Hansu had spent over 6 months to control the port. He knew the approximate rate of consumption, and he knew the bullets were running out. The door held. It was steel, with a concrete jam and beams on the inside. They pounded on it for 2 hours. Then they started shooting at the lock. 4 shots. 5. 7. The lock held. Ji-yu had installed it herself, an industrial-grade lock, with 3 bolts. Then silence. Do-hyun turned on the camera. Hansu was standing by the door, alone. The others had retreated. He was looking into the camera. Do-hyun turned on the speaker. He said 1 sentence. "You ran out of bullets 10 minutes ago. I was counting." "Leave." Hansu looked into the camera. He was silent. Then he smirked. He turned around. He left. His men followed him. Do-hyun went downstairs. He sat on the floor against the wall. His hands were shaking. Min-so approached. She crouched down beside him. She put her hand on his shoulder. She didn't say anything. She just sat there beside him. December 31st, the first year of winter. 365 days since the thermometer dropped to -40 and never recovered. It's -60 up above. The wind howls. The snow has been falling non-stop for 8 months. It's dark because the sun has become a dim yellow speck behind an icy haze and sets at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The world up there is silent. No screaming, no gunfire, just silence. Because there's no one left to scream. 2/3 of those who lived in this city a year ago are dead, frozen to death, starved to death, killed each other over the last can of stew, vanished into the snowy void as if they'd never been there. Down below, a light was on. The fortress was alive. 19 people. 6 women whom Do-hyun had taken in on the night of the apocalypse. Himself, Mina, So-yeon's 3 children, Grandpa Park, a woman with an infant who is now 4 months old and smiles when he sees Min-soo, an old man with his grandson, a childless couple who had become farmers and were helping Hana with the hydroponics, 2 guards who, over the past year, had become part of the family and taught Mina to play chess in the evenings. 19 beds, not a single one empty. Do-hyun stood in the kitchen and watched as Grandpa Park cut up a chicken, a real chicken from the fortress's chicken coop. The 3rd generation of those 5 layers that Do-hyun brought back in October. The old man worked in silence, precise movements. 40 years at the stove. His hands remember even when his mind forgets. Bowls of rice were already on the table. Real white rice. Hot. Next to them were salted cucumbers. Homemade bread with raisins. Do-hyun had baked it that morning. For Mina. Because she'd said she missed her grandmother's baking. He didn't know how her great-grandmother baked, but over the past year he'd learned to bake bread that Mina eats with her eyes closed and a smile on her face. That's enough. Soup was bubbling on the stove. Chicken soup with vegetables from Hana's hydroponic garden. Tomatoes, greens, green onions. Grown underground under artificial light by the hands of a 22-year-old girl who, a year ago, had been reading a textbook under the counter at checkout lane number 4. Do-hyun took a jar of mandarins out of the pantry. Real ones. Bought last October at the market. As fresh as yesterday. Stasis. Time doesn't pass inside. He set it on the table. Then a second can. Then he took out the cream. And chocolate. And flour. And sugar. And eggs.
Ari walked into the kitchen and saw all of this on the table. She looked at him. He said it was New Year's today, and he needed help with the cake. Ari laughed. She said she didn't know how to bake cakes. He said he'd teach her. They baked the cake for 2 hours. Ari got cream all over herself. She wrote a message with chocolate, sticking out her tongue from all the effort. Clumsy letters. Happy New Year, family. Do-hyun looked at her focused face and thought that in a past life, Ari's coffee shop had burned down in the second week, and he'd never seen the drawings on the cups again. In this life, the wall in the main hall of the fortress is covered with her paintings. Portraits of everyone. Landscapes that no longer exist. Flowers she'd never seen, yet she paints them so accurately that Hana cries. Mina by the swing. Grandpa Park at the stove. Ji-yu with a soldering iron. Min-soo with a stethoscope. Emma with a book. Soyeon with the children. And Do-hyun. She painted him from behind. He's standing by the open storeroom, taking out something invisible. His face isn't visible, only his back. Broad, reliable. Ari hung this portrait above the entrance to the dining room and said it was the most important painting in the collection. Evening. The table is set for 19 people. Rice, soup, chicken, pickled cucumbers, raisin bread, tangerines, and a cake. In the center, with a clumsy inscription. Everyone has taken their seats. Children on the adults' laps. Mina next to Soyeon, an infant in its mother's arms. Grandpa Park at the head of the table because he's the cook, and that's his right. Min-soo next to 2 injured security guards. One suffered frostbite while on duty a week ago. The other cut his hand while fixing a door. Both were sitting there eating and were still alive because Min-soo hadn't slept for 2 days when the first one was brought in with purple fingers. Ji-yu was sitting in the corner. Overalls. Hands covered in oil. She had been fixing the fan until the very last minute and came to the table without changing her clothes. Hana was next to her, blushing from all the attention. A year ago, she was a cashier whom no one noticed. Now, at every community meeting, she's the first one they listen to. Because from day one, Do-hyun asked for her opinion before anyone else's. Hana, what do you think? You understand this better than anyone. And she spoke. Quietly at first, then more confidently. By the end of the year, the grown men didn't interrupt her. Emma sat next to Ari. They'd become best friends, a foreigner and an artist. Both outsiders in this world in their own way. Both had found a home underground. 3 weeks ago, Do-hyun and Ji-yu put together a radio. They spent 2 nights tuning it in, searching for frequencies, crackling, noise, silence, and then a voice. A woman's. English. From Ohio. Emma's mom. She was alive. Her family was alive. Her dad had fixed the generator. Her brother had found food. They were holding on. Emma heard her mother's voice and slid down the wall. She sobbed so hard the walls shook. Do-hyun sat next to her on the floor and held her hand. He didn't say a word. He just held her hand. From that day on, Emma checked in for 5 minutes every evening. 5 minutes of voices from across the ocean. That was enough to keep her going. Soyeon sat with the children, a 5-year-old girl on her lap. That very same girl, from Gupo, the one who, 4 months ago, had said, Mommy Soyeon. She'd been saying it like that every day ever since. Mommy Soyeon, good morning. Mommy Soyeon, read me a story. Mommy Soyeon, I love you. Soyeon, who had spent her whole life treating other people's children because she couldn't have any of her own, held this little girl in her arms and wouldn't let her go. The quiet, constant wound that she never showed to anyone healed a millimeter at a time every time those little arms wrapped around her neck. Everyone was seated. The table was full. Candles were burning. Kerosene lamps cast warm shadows on the concrete walls covered with Ari's paintings. Quiet. Warm. It smells of bread and chicken and tangerines. Upstairs, it's -60. The wind howls. Somewhere far away in the darkness, Han Soo-jang sits by a fire in a port warehouse, remembering the daughter who was never born. Somewhere in Beijing, Vladivostok, and Los Angeles, other regressors are building their own worlds or destroying those of others. Somewhere,
The one who brought them all back is watching and waiting. But down here, 19 people are sitting around a single table, looking at a cake with a clumsy inscription. Do-hyun stood up. He picked up a glass. The glass contained dried apple compote. There's no alcohol in the fortress. That's a matter of principle. He looked at them, at each one. At Minsu, who was smiling wearily with just her eyes. At Ari, with cream on her cheek. At Ji-ya, who was roughly but gently adjusting Hannah's sweater collar. At Hannah, who was blushing and averting her eyes. At Emma, who was wiping away tears and whispering something quietly in English. At So-yeon, with a little girl sleeping on her lap. At Grandpa Park. At Mina, who was swinging her legs under the table and waiting for cake. At everyone. He opened his mouth to propose a toast.
And couldn't. He stood there in silence. 10 seconds. A glass in his hand. Everyone was looking at him, waiting. No one was rushing him. Then he spoke, quietly, almost in a whisper. Last time I died alone. This time, I won't die. Thank you for being here. Eat up. I made enough for everyone. And he sat down. Silence. A second. 2. Then Grandpa Park raised his glass and said, "To the family." Everyone raised their glasses. Dried apple compote. They drank. They began to eat. The children reached for the cake. Ari cut the first slice and gave it to Mina. Mina took a bite and said it was delicious. Emma laughed. Minsu placed her hand on the injured security guard's shoulder and said he could have one slice, but no more because of the sugar. Ji-yu ate silently and quickly. Then she looked at Do-hyun across the table. For a long time. Then she turned away toward the wall. Hana ate cake and smiled. Quietly. To herself. So-yeon wasn't eating. She was looking at the sleeping girl on her lap and stroking her hair. Do-hyun was eating rice. Slowly. Carefully. Every grain. He'd learned to eat slowly a year ago when he returned. And he hadn't forgotten. Dinner was over. The children had fallen asleep. The adults had gone their separate ways. The fortress had fallen silent. Do-hyun sat alone in the main hall. The candles were burning down. On the opposite wall hung a portrait of Ari. It showed him from behind, reaching for something out of the void. Do-hyun looked at the painting. Then he closed his eyes. The mental table of the storehouse, 1,400 lines. Each line is someone's life, someone's breakfast, someone's birthday, someone's hope. He scrolled to the end, the last line. Item number, apple tree seeds. Weight, 200 grams. Date added, October. Purpose, for spring. He'd bought them at the same market in Ansan where he'd bought strawberries. An old woman selling saplings had sold him the seeds and told him that apple trees take 7 years to bear their first crop. 7 years. That's how long winter had lasted in his past life. When it ends, when the snow melts, when the sun returns. He'll plant these seeds, and 7 years after winter ends, apples will grow on them. And he'll pick the first apple and give it to Mina, who'll be 14 by then, who won't remember the taste of apples. He'll take it with both hands, take a bite, and close her eyes, just as she does now when she eats his raisin bread. Do-hyun opened his eyes. He stood up. He walked over to the wall. He ran his fingers over Ari's painting, over his own painted back. A quiet guy in an old jacket, a former logistics manager, a man in charge of a warehouse who rewards honesty and punishes theft. A man who makes pumpkin soup with ginger because Minsu's hands are cold after his shift. Who buys a size 44 green coat because Ari said she dreamed of one when she was 16. Who asks Hana's opinion first because she's been told her whole life that her opinion doesn't matter. Who got peanut butter for Emma because she misses it more than she misses hot water. Who appointed So-yeon as a mother because she can't have children of her own but can have other people's. Who brought Ji-ya hand cream and a sweater to wear under her jumpsuit because someone had to see the woman beneath the shell. He didn't save the world. He didn't build an empire. He didn't become a king. He simply remembered the details. What kind of tea Minsu drinks. What color coat Ari wanted. At what temperature cabbage sprouts, according to Hana. That Emma misses her mom. That So-yeon wipes her glasses when she's thinking. That Ji-yu swears louder when she's in more pain. He remembered and acted. Not in general, not for everyone. For a specific person, at a specific moment, a specific thing. That was his strength. Not the warehouse, not duplication, not stasis. Memory.
The memory of who loves what, fears what, and needs to hear what to get back on their feet and move forward. Footsteps behind him. Do-hyun turned around. Mina was standing in the doorway, barefoot, in her pajamas. She rubbed her eyes. She walked over. She hugged him around the waist. He placed his hand on her head. She said quietly, "Uncle Do-hyun, tomorrow you'll bake some more raisin bread." He nodded. He didn't turn around, because if he did, he'd start crying. He said quietly, "I'll bake it. Tomorrow and the day after, and a year from now, and 7 years from now. I'll always bake it." Mina nodded. She yawned. She tugged his hand toward the beds. He followed. Up above, the wind howled. -60. Snow. Darkness. Somewhere in the white void, Hansu Jang looked east and thought of the girl who would never be born. Somewhere on the other side of the earth, other returnees were crafting their answers to a question none of them had asked. And here below, in the concrete fortress underground, a quiet guy in an old jacket followed a 7-year-old girl toward the beds. He walked and knew. He would survive. They would survive. And when, 7 years from now, the snow melts and the sun returns, he'll come up with his people. He'll sit down with them at the same table. He'll set hot rice on it, and he'll say, "Eat. I've cooked enough for everyone. Now there will always be enough."